Drax's prison. A girl sat there with her head bowed. Suddenly, a very handsome guy approached her and said that he needed her help. The girl immediately beamed and said that she was completely at his disposal. The guy said that he should become emperor. The girl was surprised. It seemed like he was starting a rebellion or something worse. The Hexen Empire already has a current emperor, as well as a crown prince ready to ascend the throne. The current emperor's younger brother, third in line to the throne, he comes immediately after the prince and his brother, despite the fact that there are two strong contenders in front of him. They can be gotten rid of quite easily. The girl giggled shyly and noted that he was, after all, a great duke. The gentleman noted that it seemed that she had already heard some rumors about him. Otherwise, she wouldn't have laughed right in his face. The girl confirmed this and asked again if there was anyone in the Empire who had not heard of him. He is invulnerable, the beast of the borderland, the black wolf of the battlefield, the might of the Empire, and the shame of the imperial family of Hexen, whose brain is made up of muscles. This is Rexed van Hexen. In someone so aggressive and cruel, no one would see a drop of the elegance and restraint inherent in members of the imperial family, even if they put on rose-colored glasses. Actions, not words, cruelty, not law. Even though he was a nobleman, no woman would dare to propose marriage to him. To top it all off, the now tranquil emperor had given him the Empire's borderland, the land of Drax in the cold north. A subtle hint that his place is only among wild animals is nothing more than an attempt to throw out the source of shame from the imperial family. However, Rexed van Hessen really did put all his efforts into the work assigned to him, since the borders of the Empire, which were under the strict supervision of the Grand Duke, were never captured. In conclusion, the girl can say that the man in front of her simply has no chance of becoming an emperor. In its entire history, this world has never known such ignorant leaders, especially those who had nothing but strength. The leaders were smart and cunning. They got everything they wanted as soon as they opened their mouths a few times. The gentleman noted that he probably knew that she knew he had nothing in his head, and the girl noted with a smile that his head was clearly empty. Rexed said that he needed her to use her head for him, since she already had something. Now the girl understood why he came to her. She didn't understand how a pathetic, petty criminal like her could even in theory help the Grand Duke become emperor. Rexed noted that he had heard that even though she had led a life of crime and had obtained other people's money by deception, she was surprisingly smart. But the girl began to say that these were just rumors, so there was no need to exaggerate. The gentleman noted that whether it was true or not, she had to make him emperor. Either she agreed or she died. After all, she was a criminal sentenced to death. The girl noted that he was right after all, because he was saying that he would get her out of here, and she would do everything in her power. The Duke confirmed this, and the girl understood that she didn't even have a choice. Even though her talents are trivial, she does everything she can to help His Majesty. He appreciates how quick she is at grasping things, and he will personally ensure that she is rewarded handsomely if everything goes well. If she wishes, he can give her her own lands and provide her with enough money to live the rest of her life in luxury. The girl was grateful to him, and the gentleman said that he would pick her up at dawn. He will take her not as a prisoner, but not as one sentenced to death, but as his tactician. She will leave this prison with honor. The girl thanked him with a smile. She looked happy, but she thought she seemed to be going crazy. After he left, she thought that he was really coming. Maybe he did have a brain. But somehow, it turns out that it would have been better without him. She didn't understand at all how he, with such a head, even thought of finding her. It was surprisingly clever of him to approach her, but she was sure that was where his intellect ended. It is not entirely clear why one should waste time on someone whom the emperor did not like. However, the girl cannot just sit and wait for execution, so it turns out she should follow him, at least for now. Well, suddenly she thought that these were some very depressing monologues. For starters, she pretended that she was arrested and entered Drax's prison. This was done completely deliberately. She is not like everyone else. And then at dawn, she was still planning to escape. In her past life, she lived in a completely different world, where she tried everything she could. Assistant at a prestigious university, financial manager, insurance company employee, secretary to the chairman of a huge company, used car salesman, and the like. All of these jobs had something in common. Each of them involved fraud. The first scam I ever committed was a fake application to a prestigious university. The reason was simple. She was simply interested in student life. After that, she pulled off all sorts of scams, both big and small. She eventually became a first-class con artist, and wanted posters were posted all over the country. Yet the government was too stupid, short-sighted, and helpless in its attempts to catch her. With a small amount of makeup and the ability to manage her status, she lived like a con artist, leaving no trace. Under the guise of a financial manager who is married to the chairman of a large company. A mansion, expensive cars, jewelry, she simply bathed in luxury. She had everything in her fraudulent life, but she quickly got tired of it and did not sell part of the chairman's shares there under her own name. She then used the money she earned to swim across the sea and find shelter, intending to start a new life. But then she tasted her first failure. People tend to lose sight of the fact that murder is a simple thing. But not for ordinary people, but for the chairman of a corporation that is above the law. It was here that she made her calculations, and it was here that her short life, which lasted only 28 years, was cut short thanks to the efforts of the enraged corporate assassins sent. The girl doesn't even really want to remember her death, because it's creepy. However, that was the price of parasitizing on someone else, so she meekly accepted death. And when she opened her eyes, it was already in a different world. If she had been born into a wealthy family, she would not have had to return to life as a swindler. But she doesn't understand why again. Perhaps she was a liar in a past life, but she had a conscience. She only exploited bad people who did evil things. However, she is grateful that she at least retains the memory of her past life, and she is glad that her resourceful head remains with her. So, after her reincarnation, she became a swindler again. And she's 21 again. She's now a criminal again. The world in which the main character was reborn was very different from her past. It reminded her of the Western Middle Ages. And although their study of science did not go far, this was compensated by magic. It is worth noting that human life, by the standards of her world, was worth almost nothing here. If a peasant without money or power commits a crime, he can be executed on the spot. But despite all the difficulties, being a criminal here is even more interesting. If you have enough money, then it's easy as pie to get hold of useful magical tools for your scams. The girl was slowly preparing to make a name for herself and become the most famous swindler in this world. She learned local customs, studied the etiquette of the nobility, and learned to make a potion for self-defense. She also took advantage of her skills in using cosmetics from her past life, constantly changing her personality throughout time. Why did the girl start saving the money she got from her scams? And at this point, he has achieved the status of a first-class criminal, a death row inmate known as the Faceless Con Artist. Of course, it's funny that there is no face on her wanted poster, but the inhabitants of the Empire are terrified of Ali, who heard her name, but an agreement was written about her title of Genius of the Art of Deception. So she wondered if the Grand Duke himself would visit her in prison to ask her criminal to become his tactician if he had a choice. He then said that she would definitely have to help him. She even became curious whether she could turn this narrow-minded individual into an emperor. But that's where it all ended. Unfortunately, she's not one of those who wastes time on meaningless nonsense that isn't worth a penny. So now is finally the time to escape. She has an hour and a half before the next guard passes through here. This should be enough to take advantage of it. The equipment used throughout the prison is mostly made of an alloy containing a large amount of a metal called haloman. Cheap Goleman is easy to think about and has a low melting point. So if she holds him like this for a little while, then he could become the key with which she could open her legs. Escape from prisons, very simply, voila, and the key is ready. Now, especially dangerous prisoners are kept in solitary confinement cells without a toilet, so she had to use this hole. But thanks to a pumping system connected to the cell of each especially dangerous prisoner, escape becomes a reality. Morning, 7 before noon, noon, evening, 9 afternoon. At this time, water is supplied to the pipes in order to wash away impurities. She needs to escape before 7 o'clock if she doesn't want to drown in feces. She had already said goodbye to Drax's damned prison. She also remembered that she had simply forgotten to say goodbye to the Grand Duke. She wished him to become emperor as he wanted and to rule long and idly. The most wanted criminal in the Hexen Empire is named Viper. Perhaps this name comes from her talent with poisons, her unrivaled success in the art of deception. Even though she's a little arrogant, he likes her eyes. Who would have thought that under the guise of a viper there is a young girl hiding, who was probably a child just recently? The Duke asked if she was really as smart as they said. The servant noted that, of course, this was true. She had been wanted for disturbing the peace in the Empire for 4 years already. This is the butler, Owen Schwach. Since she's so keen on money, she'll work hard if they offer a good sum. The butler remarked that he thought that was indeed the case, but only if they could offer her more than she got from her scams. However, if they take her with them, the Duke must never trust her. He can trust anyone in this world, but not a viper. The Duke asked again how many more times the butler intended to repeat this because he understood it the first time. He is simply concerned about His Majesty's personality and his tendency to turn a blind eye to the actions of those whom he considers his people. The butler tried to say something again, but the Duke interrupted him and asked how he was supposed to understand it. When they approached her cell, they saw that it was open and there were many officers nearby. They were in complete horror when they saw His Highness in front of them. The man went inside and saw that there was an open hatch and her shackles. The Duke demanded an explanation of what the hell had happened here. The men immediately bowed their heads and reported that the viper had most likely escaped. The Duke turned to the butler and asked him to find out how she escaped and report it to him. He hoped it wasn't because one of the guards had stolen a key. Owen asked the gentleman not to rush to conclusions. Everything could be much different. The butler approached the fork on the floor and said that it looked like she had melted it and used it as a key. This is probably how she opened the shackles and the drain grate. This means that she didn't punish the key, she was still able to escape. He still wants to hear an explanation of how the viper ended up with the tableware. It's a big question how someone could steal sharp instruments, considering that there are magical metal detectors placed throughout the building. The guard tried to say that he checked and there were no problems with the detector at all. The Duke asked again whether the viper had really passed through him yesterday. The guard hesitated when he heard that the gentleman was asking about yesterday's detector. He started with the lantern, but basically she passed through it. But when it lit up red? Then he asked her what was going on and asked what she was doing there. But the girl didn't understand at all what he meant. There was no way she could have carried anything through the detector, so she didn't understand why she should try. And then she noticed that she had completely forgotten that she had tied her hair with a spoon. She apologized and said that her hair was just in the way while she was eating. And from this, she completely forgot that she had stabbed them with a spoon. The guard was, of course, surprised, but now he understood what the matter was. If she were trying to steal something, she would have taken a fork or a knife, but certainly not a spoon. My city told her to be more careful next time. He said he was sure he had taken the spoon from her. There was no way she could have returned it. It looks like she deliberately put the spoon in her hair to distract the guards. Even if she were 100 times a viper, there was no way she could bypass a working metal detector without first turning it off. She hid the fork she had decided to steal somewhere on her body. In this way, she deceived the guard by chaining her with a spoon in order to blame the alarm on her. The Duke and the guard were shocked. They did not expect this. The Duke laughed and felt very amused by this. He noticed that this girl was really something. Just like Owen said, she's not the kind of person who's going to resign herself to the thought of being executed soon. That is exactly it. But the Duke is interested in something else. He asked why the viper was caught in his lands. She carried out her activities so carefully and meticulously that her identity could not be established for 4 years. But suddenly, someone began to shout and appeal to His Highness. It was other guards who wanted him to order their execution. The Duke did not understand what the matter was and asked again. The guard reported that His Majesty's treasure had been stolen from a safe in the basement. The Duke became a little nervous and asked if he meant his ring. The blue mineral symbolizes the noble lineage of the imperial family. This is an elfer. Every time a member of the imperial family is born, they are given a ring or bracelet decorated with an elfer. The fact that such a treasure cannot be lost is obvious. The imperial family will value these gifts no less than their lives. They give them various magical abilities and hide them in the most unexpected places. But now that gift was gone. The butler remarked that he now understood everything. This meant that she came here for the treasures of the imperial family. The reason she revealed her personal information was because she needed to infiltrate Drax's prison. The Viper deliberately allowed herself to be captured so that she could be brought here to the ring. The Duke would never have thought that a person could be so brilliant. The butler noted that the gentleman had heard what he had said to him. If he had not prepared protective measures, it would have been terrible. Previously, the gentleman was shocked by some kind of enchantment. He said it was a spell created to prevent slaves from escaping. The use of poison made from the master's blood is the principle of the bond between the master and the slave. The moment the owner activates the enchantment, the slave experiences terrible suffering. He instinctively returns to where his master is. The Duke noted that there must be trust between the employer and the employee. If he treats her like a slave, going so far as to use enchantment on her, then there is no chance that the Viper will trust and help him. The butler noted that he was so concerned about the rights of other people that it would be hard to tell that during the war he personally killed non-soldiers. The Duke remarked that he simply did not understand. That was something else. The butler remarked that he understood perfectly well what he was trying to say, but alas, there was nothing more they could do. Viper will never join them unless they force her, he is sure of it. Even if they are lucky enough, we won't be able to catch her again. She will just find another way to escape. The Duke had no intention of going that far, but it looked like he would have to. Finally, the main character was able to breathe a sigh of relief. This ring was damn beautiful. Soon, she would run away with this ring straight to Eisenbach. Eisenbach thrives on the sale of magical stones they mine. Now that she has the Imperial treasure, her next legend will be the illegitimate child of the Hexen Empire. Then she will contact the royal family of Eisenbach in Tana and reveal her identity to them. She can already imagine what kind of face the Grand Duke will have when he realizes that the ring is missing. But suddenly, she felt very ill and fell to the ground. She clutched the grass in her hands because of the pain and believed it was poison. Most likely the paralysis causing Shifen or Peraltin. Shifen causes immediate death when consumed. Peraltin also, but these are rare poisonous plants. The girl won't die, that's for sure. She developed a resistance to poisons, consuming them in small doses, but when she could have been poisoned by something is completely unclear. She began to believe that the poison was mixed into the food they gave her in prison. It was colorless and tasteless, she didn't notice anything, and the food didn't have a specific smell, so it definitely wasn't Shifen. But if it's Peraltin, then her body will soon be completely paralyzed and she will hardly be able to blink normally. Her body moves on its own. She doesn't understand when this will happen. When she crawled to someone's feet, the pain stopped. When she looked up, she saw the Duke in front of her, asking where she was going. The girl began to worry, because in front of her was Rex Van Hessen himself. He should have suspected something was wrong when they grabbed her with such ease, but he wasn't one to think ahead, so he didn't expect this. Who would have thought that her motive was the Imperial treasure? The girl started laughing and remarked that it was very pretty. He noted that he didn't think she stole him just because of his beauty. I wondered what else she might need it for. And he noted that, however, she could keep it for herself. After that, he put a ring on her ring finger, and the girl was completely shocked. She didn't expect this and noted it because if he lost the Imperial treasure, he would have problems. But it doesn't matter, because now she will always be there. Just like the ring she is wearing, the girl from me belongs to him. The girl was completely horrified and did not understand why he decided that. He is as heartless to me as people think. It is simply terrible to watch her little body shudder in agony. Now she understood what kind of poison it was. It was all a plan by Rexid Van Hessen, who was waiting for her to escape. It seems he is more cautious than she thought. The girl noted that she could have died from such a dose of poison. But the gentleman said not to worry. She definitely would not die from such a quantity. And if someone with her talents died so soon, it would be the greatest loss because she is a genius in the matter of deception. He said that he would repeat himself, that he needed to become emperor. No matter the cost, the girl now realized that he had a completely different motive. Let him know that he has no talent to run an empire. But she doesn't understand why he wants to create problems for the Imperial family so much. Rexid told the Viper to follow him. He promises to give her everything she asks for. The girl tried to say something, but he said that it was not a proposal. He said she should understand that in this country, death row inmates have little choice. If she wants to live, she will do as he says. Instead of dying and letting her great brain go to waste, she should rather benefit both of them and work for him. The Duke also noted that it was very hot now, and if possible, he would like to grant her the honorary title of Special Messenger. But he grabbed her, and she didn't expect it. He noted that, due to her skill in deception, she would simply run away if he allowed her to go on her own. And so, he will simply pick her up and carry her in his arms. Of course, he wouldn't carry her in his arms the whole way, so they continued in a carriage. She can't be trusted. Everything she says is a lie. Every expression on this girl's face is a mask. He's not even sure that she's a real Viper. As soon as the opportunity presents itself, he'll take her skin. Suddenly, he asked her name and the girl was surprised. Not James, who went door to door selling counterfeit jewelry. Not Elizabeth, the Empire teacher. They didn't even know her name. Young merchant Johnny. The girl noted that it seemed like he was really interested in her, and he confirmed this. and the rest didn't know about her at all, so it looks like he'll have to uncover many more of her lies. The girl remarked that she was very interested. It seemed that he was not as ignorant as people said. In general, the butler told him this, but he will not tell her about this. Still, Rex had wanted to know what her name was. The girl said that she didn't have a name. He asked again, and she said that she didn't have a name because no one had given her one. The Duke believed that she simply had no parents. The girl replied that she didn't remember, but she didn't just fall out of the sky, someone gave birth to her. He wondered if she had lived in a normal family, perhaps she would not have thought about becoming a fraud. She was just lucky to live with the right people, and not for long. The reason why it is so difficult to catch her when I am is that she is not registered anywhere. She has no documents in any country. She will stay with him and help him in any way she can. So if he wants to give her a name, he can choose anyone. The Duke asked again if she would really help him, and the girl did not understand why she would go with him to his estate if she did not intend to be with him. The Duke replied that he had no idea. He didn't know what was going on in her little head. He doesn't understand how he knows that she isn't thinking of an escape plan right now. The Viper said that she had changed her mind. Before she only knew about him from rumors, and she didn't think that she could trust and serve him openly. The Duke wanted to know why she changed her mind. The girl replied that she would never have thought that he would think of everything and send food. She also noted that such unwavering determination is sometimes simply necessary. I became curious about what he poisoned her with, believing it was chiffon or Peraltin. She realized that it was a colorless, odorless poison, so she didn't even realize that she had consumed it. But she knows that chiffon has a certain aroma, which is why she decided that it was Peraltin, but the symptoms did not match. The Duke asked why she was asking him. He didn't look like an idiot. She thought he would just tell her what he poisoned her with. Still, it's logical. He could tell her, but he doesn't really want to. Even if she is just a criminal who doesn't know her rights, he wants her to help him. But he can't just tell her that without it putting a spell on her. The girl said with a smile that she was still asking to give her a name. She would agree to any. This young lady is very pretty. It was a waste of her wits to commit fraud, but without that talent, she would have had to deal with many of the problems herself. It would be difficult for a beautiful commoner to live a normal life here in the Empire. He'll probably have to think about a name, but he agrees. He noted that he had to admit that he hadn't expected the brilliant swindler to be so beautiful. The girl even became embarrassed and noted that he had better stop trying to tear her face off. She noticed that her face was real and she could assure him of it. The Duke realized that he was caught, and she said that she agreed with him. Caution is doubtful. All this is a very useful quality. The most important ones to survive in a big city. The Duke was confused, but suddenly he smelled a strange smell. He looked at her, and the girl smiled shyly. She used the sewer system where everyone was doing their business to escape. The Duke noted that nothing could be done about it. He asked the coachman to stop the carriage. They entered a wonderful store. The girl was shocked. Right from the doorway, the Duke told Madame that he was buying the entire store. He buys all the clothes, but the size must be suitable for this girl. The Viper immediately began to say that one set of clothes would be enough for her, but he didn't understand how one could live with one set of clothes. If they got dirty, she couldn't just wash them and wear them again. The girl said she thought he did the same, but the Duke was horrified. The Viper said that she did not understand how she could wear such expensive clothes. Of course she washed them if they got dirty and wore them again. The Duke did not agree with this, and said that he did not understand what she was doing with all this stolen money. He asked, "But what does she spend it on if not on clothes for herself?" The girl replied that she had been providing shelter, and since the day she was abandoned in a dark alley, there were many sick people there and the medicine was very expensive. She hasn't spent a penny yet. She's on luxury items. But the Duke said something like, as long as she belongs to him, she doesn't have to worry about money. If there is something she needs, she can just tell him. She is at that age that you want such things. The girl confirmed his words because everything was indeed so. But if she were in his place, she most likely would not even have been able to make a final decision in such a situation. So, without thinking, she suddenly asked if he was seriously going to buy her all this, because such an offer seemed too generous to be true. The Duke merely looked at her in surprise. Of course he would do it, and he didn't understand why she was asking such questions, since he had already decided everything himself. However, the girl did not calm down and, still doubting, clarified whether she could really accept these things, because such a gift seemed like something impossible. Rex had confidently replied that she certainly could. Starting today, he would buy her anything she wanted. All she had to do was ask. So there is no need to be shy or doubt. But if it is so difficult for her to choose, then let her choose at least one outfit to wear right now. The girl, having gained a little courage, began to walk around the store and stopped at one pink outfit, becoming interested in it and asked the saleswoman about it. The Duke immediately turned to Madame, informing her that the outfit suited her and therefore it should be prepared properly since she would wear it now. Without wasting any time, the woman immediately began preparing, quickly tidying up the dress and then handing it over to the girl. At the same time, she noted that the store has a separate room where the girl can calmly change clothes if she wishes. Viper hesitated. She didn't want to say it out loud, but she'd never worn anything like this before, and that was where her uncertainty lay. So, after a little hesitation, she carefully asked if Madame could help her with this. If she didn't mind, of course, since she couldn't handle it herself. The woman froze in obvious confusion and asked again if she had understood her correctly, but immediately felt the Duke's menacing gaze on her. He asked with displeasure whether this was really such a difficult request, since she could undoubtedly help the girl put on a dress. Fearing the Duke's possible displeasure, Madame hastily assured him that she would, of course, help and pointed out where to go. She was clearly nervous, choosing her words carefully and looking as if she was afraid of saying the wrong thing and irritating the Duke even more. He simply couldn't believe that Viper was just a young, nameless girl from an orphanage, because her surprise seemed genuine. She is so amazed by this little gift, as if she had never received anything like it before, and was not accustomed to such care. He believed that taking care of her and showering her with attention was a great way to win her devotion, and so he spared no effort. However, as he watched the proceedings, he couldn't help but wonder, did women really spend so much time just to put on one single dress? Duke Rexid treated women with indifference, never becoming close to any. However, he couldn't trust this one. Every word she said seemed a lie. Every action had a hidden meaning. There wasn't a shred of sincerity in her gaze, and her manner seemed meticulously rehearsed. He suddenly felt a surge of anger. It simply wouldn't take him that long to change. His patience was exhausted. He stepped forward decisively, pushed the door open, and, without hesitation, entered the room, ready to find out what was really going on. Inside, he saw a woman bound with ropes, clutching a knife. She was clearly wary, as if expecting an attack. In that instant, he realized it was that damned trick again. Another trick, another lie. She'd managed to fool him again, and it was unbearable. His voice was sharp, filled with irritation. He demanded an explanation, wanting to hear the truth, not another convoluted lie. The woman answered without hesitation. The stranger had threatened her, and then simply disappeared. There was a note of concern in her voice, but Rexid was in no hurry to believe it. He barely suppressed a grin. Taking him for a fool? It would be pointless. It was all too obvious that this scene had been staged in advance. And yet he wanted to hear more. He waited for the woman to tell him exactly what words had been spoken the moment they entered the room. She merely chuckled in response. If she'd known there was a window here, she might have come herself. Her calm was irritating. Then she turned to the stranger and asked directly what she was trying to achieve, what she needed from her this time. The next moment, she pulled out a knife, pointing it at her, not giving her a single chance to escape or resist. The girl bowed her head slightly and remarked mockingly. Since they were alone, she had one important question. She was planning to head to the outskirts of the city where there were fewer people, and now she needed to know exactly where to go. The woman replied that there was a shortcut through the shopping street, and that at the exit there was a small boutique that was easy to get out of. The girl listened carefully and then told her to grip the knife tighter and raise her head, preparing for the next step. Everything went according to plan. She quickly changed and left the room without delay, saying as a parting shot that she had to leave already. One awkward movement, and the consequences could be disastrous, so it's best for a woman to avoid making unnecessary movements. Smiling, she thanked her for her cooperation, noting that she had done an excellent job with the task. If Owen found out how it all ended, he would go back to thinking that the Duke was a pathetic man who allowed himself to be treated like that. He even remembered how he looked when he was angry. Viper had driven him to this state more than once, and it always looked the same. Tense facial features, clenched fists, and a gaze brimming with rage. He picked up the knife, and it immediately became clear she'd grabbed more than just a fork from prison. Somehow, Viper had managed to get her hands on this knife as well, which only proved one thing. She was always prepared for any eventuality. He asked incredulously, had she really said the shortest route was through Pakum? His voice was full of doubt, because this route seemed not just risky, but deadly. The woman confidently confirmed her words. Then he realized he had no choice but to use magic. It was hard to believe she had actually gone there, but there was no doubt. This was the most dangerous area of the city. The narrow streets were teeming with criminals, and every turn could conceal a deadly trap. Even the most desperate tried to avoid this place, but apparently not her. He couldn't delay. Every second lost increased the distance between them. If he stalled, she would move even further, which meant he had to act immediately. He quickly left the shop, focusing on his magic. Activating it again, he tried to locate her. She was moving, and he had to catch up with her before it was too late. Meanwhile, Viper had already managed to get quite far. Her legs carried her forward, and her thoughts were focused on the fact that she must not stop. While he was looking for her, she had a chance to slip away. She relied on his naivety, and he fell for it again. This wasn't the first time she'd lied to him or feigned helplessness. Who would have thought it would be so easy to deceive him? She was certain that someone like him would never become emperor. Though he tried, his mistakes spoke for themselves. A leader must be insightful, but he allowed himself to be fooled by tricks, even the most obvious ones. No matter how hard he tried, he wouldn't succeed. He lacked the toughness, the intelligence that a ruler needs, and time after time, he only proved this by allowing himself to be deceived. She knew that if she lost consciousness here, in a place like this, it would be the end for her. There were no good Samaritans in this area. Here, she would either be killed or sold, and both options were unacceptable to her. But suddenly, she crashed into someone. The impact was unexpected, sharp. For a moment, her vision blurred, but soon the figure of a stranger appeared before her, and something about him immediately struck her as dangerous. At first, she couldn't get a good look at him, but when her eyes adjusted to the darkness, an unfamiliar man appeared before her. His face was unfamiliar to her, but his gaze revealed a man accustomed to power. He approached her, never taking his eyes off her, and mockingly inquired what such a noble lady was doing in such an inappropriate place. His voice held a mixture of curiosity and obvious threat. Viper instantly realized the situation was becoming dangerous. Had she known she'd be faced with such a turn of events, she would have chosen clothes that would allow her to move faster. Right now, her outfit was getting in the way. The man reached out to her, clearly intending to grab her, but she reacted just in time. Her body responded instantly, and she managed to jump aside, avoiding his grasp. She grinned and promised to show him something unusual, her little trick. Her voice was confident, but inside she felt a slight tension. However, when she tried to demonstrate her plan, her body suddenly weakened and she collapsed onto the cold floor, unable to maintain her balance. This sensation was already familiar to her. She'd experienced exactly the same thing in the forest. It couldn't be ordinary poison. Its effects seemed too strange and unpredictable. It was most likely magic, but its nature remained unclear. Perhaps it was triggered precisely at the moment of application of force, since the girl felt no pain, and it was as if her body no longer belonged to her. The man watching her came closer, his eyes flashing with joy. He'd clearly expected this outcome, but it didn't come as a surprise to her. He didn't bother explaining what was happening to her, so she had to figure it out on her own. This angered her, but she wasn't about to show weakness. The man laughed, looking down at her. He sarcastically remarked that it seemed she had overestimated her strength and was now paying for her overconfidence. With undisguised sarcasm, he added that her outfit was indeed very nice. His words were mocking, and there was a clear hint of malice in them. Then, shaking his head with a smile, he remarked that she must be crazy to decide to crawl on the ground in broad daylight like a miserable beggar. He mockingly asked where she was so eager to go, and mockingly suggested that she hurry up, since such a beautiful lady clearly shouldn't linger in such a position. The girl watched him in horror, not believing he was being serious. His behavior seemed completely inappropriate to her, as if he had lost touch with reality. The man approached her slowly, his smile unwavering. A dangerous glint flashed in his gaze, sending an unpleasant chill down her spine. He spoke again, wondering what she'd pumped herself up with to make her look so pathetic. His voice was tinged with undisguised curiosity. He then suggested that people like her were unlikely to buy the cheap junk sold on the streets, as they always had access to something much more valuable. He confidently declared that she must have something better hidden away, and expressed hope that she had saved some for him. There was a hint of blatant innuendo in his voice. But suddenly he froze, raised his head, and the next moment his face contorted in surprise. He clearly saw something that made him tense. The viper also raised its head and barely managed to notice the man fly off to the side, as if struck by an unknown force. It all happened too quickly. Blood flashed through the air. He was dead. His body collapsed to the ground, and scarlet drops scattered across the floor, painting it a dark color. The girl turned her head to the side and saw a huge man. He looked at her with a grim expression and coldly asked if she wanted to die. He stepped closer, hovering over her, and then, with a slight grin, asked why she was sprawled out there, as if this was the most comfortable place to rest. It took Viper almost 20 minutes to reach this street from the boutique. She thought she'd gone far enough, but the Duke was faster. He'd already caught up with her. She desperately tried to crawl even further, hoping to put more distance between them. But her strength was waning, and her legs wouldn't obey her. At this time, the Duke, without hesitation, approached her pursuer, grabbed him by the face, and squeezed so hard that he did not even have time to react. Viper stared at the sight in amazement. How could he lift that brute so easily with one hand? There wasn't even a hint of strain in his movements. The Grey rose to her feet and, without losing her composure, asked the Crown Prince to wait a moment. It was important for her to do this before the Duke took any drastic action. She knew it would end this way and tried to stop him beforehand. But it was useless now. The situation had already gotten out of her control. The Duke reminded her again of what he'd already said. The ring wasn't going anywhere. And now she had no doubt that getting rid of it was simply impossible. The Viper realized that as long as this ring was on her finger, she couldn't escape. Running was pointless, because her every move was being monitored. She admitted that she had thought so. She had taken the ring with her only in case of emergency, but as it turned out, it hadn't helped avoid problems. The girl asked if the Duke was using a spell, and he calmly confirmed it, seeing no point in hiding the obvious. Now everything became completely clear. She couldn't escape, and even asking was pointless. The Duke knew perfectly well that she understood this. Realizing resistance was futile, she merely expressed gratitude for his quick response. Otherwise, her dress would certainly have been ruined. The Duke looked at her with obvious suspicion. He was certain she was planning to run away again, and he had no doubt in his suspicions. Viper tried to dissuade him. This time she hadn't even hoped for a successful escape. The realization of magical control had killed her last hopes of freedom. Now that she knew the spell was working, she wasn't going to do anything stupid again. The only question was what would happen next. The girl looked closely at the Duke and asked why he was looking at her so strangely. There was something strange in his gaze. In response, without further ado, he picked her up in his arms and headed in the other direction, leaving her no choice. Viper sighed and tried to explain that she could walk on her own. There was a note of reconciliation in her voice. She didn't want to argue. She began to apologize for running away, but the Duke cut her off. He made it clear that her feet would not touch the ground until she reached the estate. Moreover, he advised her not to even try to break free if she did not want to make her situation worse. Well, there was no choice. She wasn't going to suffer the same fate as that unfortunate guy, so she'd stay here for now, as valuable cargo. Here comes her second kidnapping. Only this time she didn't even have to resist. It all happened too quickly. The Duke carried her right to the estate gates, never letting her go. She had no doubt he would do just that. The butler, seeing this scene, was clearly surprised. He hadn't expected to see the Duke calmly carrying her over his shoulder as if it were the natural course of things. The butler looked at the Duke carefully and asked with slight bewilderment what he was holding in his hands and why he had returned at such a late hour. His tone made it clear he hadn't expected such an appearance. Rexid sighed wearily and remarked angrily that this girl was running around the city like a madwoman, giving him no chance to catch her. Hunting her was proving more difficult than he'd expected. Hanging upside down, the girl finally managed to speak up and ask to be put down. Blood rushed to her head, causing everything around her to throb and ache unpleasantly. The Duke stopped mocking her and gently lowered her to the floor. Her legs could barely support her weight, and dark spots flashed before her eyes. Her head was spinning from the sudden change in position. Owen straightened up abruptly, greeting her in a solemn voice. He quietly announced that from now on she was a guest at the Grand Duke of Hessen's estate, and she would do well to remember that. With a slight grin, he called her nothing less than a genius of deception, then added that she was now known here as Mrs. Viper. His tone was both respectful and mocking. Rexit got straight to the point without delay. He declared that they needed to sign a contract, the terms of which had already been worked out and were non-negotiable. As it turned out, the agreement had been prepared in advance, and Owen immediately presented it, confirming that everything had already been settled, and all that remained was to sign. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise, clearly not expecting such speed, and Owen introduced himself with a polite smile, explaining that he was His Highness's butler and was in charge of all matters in the estate. He added that she should simply address him as Owen, without unnecessary formalities, since they would be crossing paths often from now on. The girl looked at him incredulously and, narrowing her eyes, asked if he was the one who cast the spell on her. There was irritation in her voice. Owen looked a little embarrassed, but he didn't deny it. He nodded, confirming her guess, and even expressed regret that he had to resort to force in this situation. He admitted that he had considerable experience, but even he could not always predict all of her cunning moves and well-thought-out traps. The girl merely chuckled. She'd long known that the key to a perfect scam was concealing one's emotions and remaining vigilant. It was clear from Owen's eyes and demeanor that he was no ordinary butler. It wasn't the Grand Duke's idea to cast a spell on her, but his. The girl, recognizing the gravity of the situation, cautiously asked if there was a way to remove the magic. Even if she was extremely polite, would he tell her how to break the spell? The butler looked at her with a slight smile and, asking again, clarified. Even if such a method existed, he would be the first to know about it. She must understand that magic of this level leaves no loopholes. It was an ancient spell, working in conjunction with a special potion. It was devised long ago to prevent slaves from escaping their masters. This magic leaves no room for freedom. In reality, there's no way to undo it. The only exception is the death of the slave or their owner. Only then is the magical bond severed. The butler hastened to explain this before the girl could come to the obvious conclusion. If I remember that the Duke's death will break the spell, then I just need to kill the Duke. The magic works by forcing the master's blood into the slave's veins. If the master dies, this blood instantly dries up. The spell is broken, but the consequences are inevitable. He hoped she didn't need to explain what would happen next. The master's death meant her own death. By killing the Duke, she would send herself to the grave with him. When the Duke himself learned of this magical property, he was utterly horrified. Without thinking, he grabbed the butler, unable to hide his shock. He shouted at him, demanding an explanation. Why hadn't he told him this right away? Why had this crucial detail of the spell been hidden? The Duke was furious. The girl watched silently. Gradually, a clear picture emerged in her mind. She now understood what this man was like. Besides his lack of intelligence, the Duke had a weak spot. She saw how easily he lost his temper when put in an awkward position. He holds the fates of those condemned to death in his hands. Whatever he orders her to do, she has no choice. However, she was surprised by how emotionally he reacted. This man destroys everything in his path. If something moves, he kills it. If it doesn't move, he first makes it move and then kills it anyway. The butler remarked that he wouldn't have cast the spell if the Duke had known about its side effects. Clearly, the information had been withheld on purpose. Otherwise, Miss Viper would have remained free, and His Highness's carefully planned plan would have collapsed before it even began. The girl just chuckled to herself. Why were there so many madmen around him? Didn't he even notice? The butler merely smiled and shrugged. It's simple. He's always wanted prosperity and stability for this land. That's why these drastic measures are being taken. He then asked if Miss Viper knew that Count Shugi, whom she had once deceived, had committed suicide when his luck had turned against him. Barons Follow and Shooten, trusting her, invested in disastrous deals. Having lost everything, they were forced to sell their titles to survive. The girl smiled slightly upon hearing this. No, she didn't know such details, but the information amused her. The butler merely shrugged and said indifferently that this shouldn't be surprising. All these people, one way or another, deserved their fate. Count Shugi didn't just run a business. He controlled an entire network of illegal human trafficking operations. His slave market was the largest and most influential in the region. The two barons with whom he collaborated were co-owners of a huge casino, generating fabulous profits. However, the Duke had no doubt that Miss Viper knew about their shady dealings, even without his knowledge. All of Miss Viper's robbery victims used their wealth to circumvent the law and evade justice. None of them were cleared before the court or before their own consciences. The Duke noted with a cold smile that since these people were no longer alive, there were no problems with them. However, that didn't mean all of Miss Viper's own crimes could be so easily forgotten. And the girl herself didn't commit these daring robberies for someone else's benefit. Her goal was never to atone for evil or protect anyone. Of course not. She simply chose goals she wouldn't regret later. It made life easier for her, without burdening herself with unnecessary guilt. In an ideal world where evil people didn't exist, no one would need to steal, kill, or hide. Everyone could simply live in peace. But reality is harsh. Miss Viper was declared wanted 4 years ago and sentenced to death for her many crimes. Her name has become a symbol of horror for some and admiration for others. Luckily for her, His Highness Rexed Van Hessen decided to give her a chance. He offered her the chance to forget her past and start a new life as a law-abiding citizen. From now on, the Grand Duke himself and his entire staff will view her not as a criminal, but as a business partner. This partnership will benefit everyone. As soon as she signs the contract, her fate will change. She pledges to help His Highness take the throne, no matter what the means. And, of course, she'll sign it. At that moment, she feels like the chief of staff at the Blue House, making an important political decision. The Blue House is the official residence of the South Korean president. Who would have thought the day would come when she would sign such a dishonest agreement? The butler asked incredulously if she was sure she didn't want to reread the contract before signing it. This could have saved her from any unwanted surprises in the future. After all, according to the terms, it is no longer possible to change its content, although, if necessary, clauses concerning her personal requirements can be added. For example, salaries. An annual renewable contract, the salary amount of which has not yet been specified, but with a set cap of 1 billion norths. Moreover, any additional expenses incurred during the work process would be covered without question. Essentially, there was nothing more to discuss. The butler was stunned. He couldn't even figure out when she'd managed to read the entire document. He thought she'd simply sign it without looking. The Duke narrowed his eyes in displeasure and irritably ordered her to stop dawdling. He was impatient to complete this formal process as quickly as possible. The girl decided she needed to add something important to the contract. She took her time, knowing it could radically change the entire agreement between them. The Duke kindly asked her what she wanted to change. She replied that if she ever proved her worth and his need for her services disappeared, he should break the contract. She was under a spell that made her feel controlled. She couldn't understand what would happen if he continued to treat her like a slave, even after becoming emperor. The gentleman asked again if she really considered him so dishonest. The girl looked up, explaining that they had met less than a day ago and it was difficult for her to trust him so quickly. She wanted to be released from her contract as soon as its terms were fulfilled and the contract terminated. This was an important condition for her to move on. Despite her doubts and fears, she signed the contract anyway. It was her decision, despite all the risks, which she was fully aware of. Once the contract is terminated, Rek'Sai Van Hessen will no longer use spells to fulfill the terms. Both parties guarantee the fulfillment of the agreement by signing it for life. The contract, forged from Eisenbach's purest mana, guaranteed its fulfillment with its own power, and breaking it would cost one's life. It was a powerful tool for enforcing obligations. She believed the Duke had such a contract and her intuition was correct. He paused, not immediately responding to her remark, as if considering whether to reveal everything at once. The Duke smiled and noted that he hadn't expected her to know about such a contract. His surprise was brief, but it didn't go unnoticed in the girl's eyes. He agreed to her proposal, but the butler was clearly shocked. He hadn't expected the Duke to so easily agree to the terms, which were quite harsh. The Duke instructed the butler not to create unnecessary disorder. He had no intention of causing a scene, especially after he had already taken someone's life without warning anyone. Viper sensed that Rek'Sai Van Hessen had truly weakened. She was confident in her intuition and was glad that her senses had been correct. She smiled happily and asked if he agreed to the terms. He confirmed this and said he hadn't cast the spell to treat her like a slave. It was the least he could do. However, he hoped that everything would be done well. He didn't want to be disappointed in her professionalism and expected her to justify his trust. The girl confidently declared herself a true expert. The Duke told her to simply follow him, confident she could handle the task. When they entered the treasury, her eyes widened in amazement. There was so much there that she couldn't immediately comprehend how valuable the place was. She was amazed. The girl couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had never encountered such riches before, and she didn't expect to see anything like this. The Duke, noticing her surprise, asked if she wanted anything from what she saw. He also noted that the treasury was enchanted, an important aspect of its security. If she tries to activate this mechanism, she'll be in danger and she should think twice before doing anything. The risk is too great and the consequences could be fatal. It all depends on her decision. If she decides to steal something, it will lead to dire consequences. It's better to just walk alongside him, take what he needs, and be honest if she likes it. The girl was delighted, but the Duke, observing her joy, cautiously noted that such things were of no importance to him. He wasn't fixated on material things. He didn't care. She felt an incredible relief, like a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and her emotions were so vivid that she could not hide her joy that everything had worked out. When the gentleman turned around, he couldn't understand how she had managed to put on all those rings so quickly. It was strange and, in some ways, even surprising. He was completely shocked to see that there were already so many jewels around her. She had somehow managed to collect them, and he couldn't believe his eyes. The Duke wondered at what point she had managed to take all of this. They were moving so close together that he didn't notice her grab the jewels. The girl, with a slight smile, replied that it was better for him not to know, because it would be for his own good if he knew nothing about how she did it. As they approached the center of the hall, he stopped, but she did not stop and continued moving forward, without any doubt in her decision. The girl said that someday he might need her services, and she wants to understand if he is sure that he is ready to spend all this on her because her help is expensive. The gentleman calmly replied that it didn't matter to him. He considered it useless. She was a little surprised by his words, but at the same time, she realized that Rek'Sai truly didn't care. He was a man who had everything and needed nothing, and for him, power and material wealth were not important. He simply didn't need them. Why then had he decided to become emperor? The question remained unanswered, and she couldn't understand his motives. Suddenly, he called her to him. They approached the counter, and he placed the contract there. It was the moment when things became serious, and she knew the choice had been made. He told her that to proceed further, they needed to activate the contract. This was a prerequisite for continuing their journey. Rek'Sai pulled out a dagger and said the contract's notch had to be filled with the blood of both parties. This was a mandatory condition, and she had to agree. The girl felt a wave of fear as she was about to take an important step. She didn't know what to expect, but she had to face this challenge. She asked again if he really hadn't changed his mind, because she hadn't expected that to be the case. She wasn't prepared for such a turn of events. The Duke said that wasn't the issue. A deep incision would have to be made to fill the hole. He hoped she wasn't alarmed by the prospect. He added that he hoped the scar on her hand wouldn't bother her, as it was inevitable. He did everything he could to ensure the agreement was fulfilled. The girl was completely horrified. This was completely unexpected, and she turned to him with a question, reminding him that he had said he wanted to become emperor. Viper believed that Rek'Sai truly deserved his position, because he fought on the battlefield, killing not only soldiers but also knights, leaving blood and death in his wake. But if the Duke is so soft and indecisive, it could become a serious problem for everyone. Softness in his case is a threat that could backfire in the future. She might have to act more harshly if the situation required it. She could kill girls, children, and maybe even old people if that was necessary to achieve her goal. She asked him again if he would hesitate if the time came when such decisions had to be made. After all, her trials would not be gentle, and it was important to know his answer. She decided to pick up the knife, intending to cut herself. But Rek'Sai quickly grabbed it and confidently said that this was a completely different matter. There was no need to go down that path. He was sure that he would not be afraid and would not retreat, but the process itself was difficult for him. It was difficult for him to look at his own blood. It made him feel disgusted. However, if you think about it, they weren't obliged to shed the same amount of blood. All that was required was to prove their readiness and decide how important this moment was. Viper was in complete shock as she watched Rek'Sai cut his own skin without the slightest hesitation. He didn't hesitate, just did it as if it were routine. Rek'Sai asked for her hand, and she without hesitation moved closer to him, ready to fulfill his request despite everything that was happening. They moved in that direction, never turning back. He carefully cut her finger, and she felt a drop of blood roll down, symbolizing the conclusion of their contract. It was the beginning of a new journey for both of them. The contract was concluded in such a simple, even primitive manner, but therein lay its strength. It was honest and direct, without unnecessary words or ceremony. Viper thought wryly that this method of concluding such an important contract seemed a bit primitive, but perhaps that was precisely part of its strength, simplicity. The Duke, looking around at everything that was happening, noted that since she had agreed, it meant that she believed in his intentions and did not consider him capable of making her his slave. Dvoritsky, for his part, added that trust is important, but you can't trust everyone. Even heaven has its dark side, and no one should trust so easily. Viper noticed that his butler was truly very smart, and Rek'Sai certainly wouldn't have managed without him. He was a man who always knew what to do in difficult situations. Rek'Sai suggested focusing on building trust between them. Now that they were bound by contract, he would trust her, but she shouldn't think he could be fooled. The Viper noticed that the Duke was probably afraid to hear her say she was planning to deceive him. This alarmed him, and she decided to clarify the situation without leaving any room for misunderstanding. She became a little angry at his concern, but tried to reassure him. She said she understood his doubts perfectly well, and now everything depended on whether he decided to believe her words. The Duke expressed a desire to believe her, but he still couldn't shake the feeling she was hiding something. He wondered if there was something else she wasn't telling him directly. He offered her a chance to open up and lay it all out there, and promised he wouldn't judge her if she decided to reveal her secrets. But there was still tension in the air. However, his displeasure only intensified when he realized she was simply ignoring him. This angered him even more, and he felt his patience wearing thin. The Viper, despite the tension of the situation, began to laugh. Suddenly, she peeled off her skin, as if shedding something unnecessary, revealing who she truly was. Beneath the mask was a completely different face, a girl with short pink hair. She stood up, confident in her choice. This was her way of shedding all that was unnecessary. She added that she looks much cuter this way, and she likes her new appearance. But in reality, she always tried to make the mask more perfect than her real face. The girl explained that the color of her hair and eyes was just a mask, an attempt to hide her real face, which she always tried to make more confusing and secretive so that people could not expose her. The Duke looked at her in horror and asked if it was really her. She, with a slight expression on her face, asked him if he really wanted to be sure. He panicked and started screaming that she was crazy. He just wanted her to tell him the truth, not show him anything else. He was willing to accept her words, as long as she didn't hide anything. After this, the Duke turned and walked away. The Viper, slightly disappointed, asked him not to be angry. Her request was gentle, but there was still a hint of resentment in it. She remembered the last time she showed her face to anyone without a mask, when she was 6 years old. It was a painful and frightening memory, but also an important one. The Duke was shocked to realize how she had been forced to live with such a condition from such a young age. It changed his view of her, and he began to feel more compassion for her. Viper explained that her face changed with age, and for her safety, she was forced to hide it to protect herself from possible threats and unpleasant situations. The Duke, still confused, remarked that she could probably simply change her face to begin her manipulations again. He continued to wonder if her real face might be completely different. She, smiling slightly, noted that she had almost forgotten another important point she needed to clarify. The Duke sensed that not everything was yet clear. Viper removed her contacts and apologized. She admitted she'd become so accustomed to them that she'd completely forgotten they were just part of her mask. They were another layer of her multi-layered personality. The Duke approached her with curiosity and caution and began to carefully probe her face. He was certain she was no longer hiding anything that might cast doubt on her words. He hoped that now, after this, she wouldn't hide anything important from him. His gaze was full of hope, but also wariness, as if he were prepared for any turn of events. Viper, smiling faintly, declared that she was no longer hiding anything from him. It hurt when he pulled her cheeks, but she couldn't help but let him do it, even though it hurt her. Lying on her bed, Viper gazed thoughtfully at the rings she'd been given. It was a strange pleasure to observe such simple things as rings when the silence around her was tense. The Duke asked if she truly loved the rings so much. He still couldn't understand why she was so attached to them, as they were simple pieces of jewelry, not anything meaningful to her. The Viper replied that she didn't particularly like the rings, and she couldn't understand why she'd allowed him to kidnap her earlier, not realizing that her life had been full of unjustified decisions and compromises. The Duke, a little embarrassed, remarked that if she wanted anything, he would always be ready to take her wherever she wanted. He offered her that whatever she wanted, he would always be there. Afterwards, she asked what she should do next, and the Duke replied that they would discuss the matter after they ate. He was in no hurry, believing that now was the time to eat. At that moment, someone knocked on the door. The Duke nodded and invited them in. He was already prepared for the visit, not expecting his guests to surprise everyone. When the door opened, the girl was stunned. She hadn't expected to see them in this house, and her eyes instantly filled with curiosity and surprise. The woman was completely shocked when she saw the girl, but quickly regained her composure. The girl, wasting no time, greeted them with a kind smile to ease the tension. The maid couldn't believe her eyes. She could barely contain her surprise, because the young master, who had been alone for so long, had finally found himself a girlfriend. She approached the gentleman and said that he had lived alone for so long, and now he had found such a beautiful bride that this was real happiness for everyone. However, the Duke apparently didn't understand what the maid was talking about. He was surprised that the butler hadn't told her they were planning to marry, as that point should have been obvious. The Duke insisted that he and the girl were planning to marry, despite the misunderstandings. Marco, one of the new acquaintances, introduced himself as the man in charge of the kitchen and greeted her with a smile. The girl, smiling, said that she was very pleased to meet him, but she was a little embarrassed as she did not know how to introduce herself properly, since she did not yet have a last name. The Duke, smiling, decided to help her with this and announced that her name was Rosika. The girl was surprised, not expecting to be called that, but tried not to show her feelings. She quickly recovered and, smiling slightly, confirmed that her name was indeed Rosika. Her voice was confident, though inside she felt a slight sense of confusion. She also admitted that, to her great embarrassment, she didn't have a last name and so it was better to just call her Rosika. It wasn't anything special, but it bothered her. Everyone in the room immediately wondered if the name had any special meaning or history. This added interest to the conversation, and everyone eagerly awaited the answer. The servants remarked that it was a great honor for them to meet the girl, as it was a rare event that didn't happen every day in their home. They all sensed the significance of the moment. Masha, who was standing nearby, greeted her without any formality. She thought she should introduce herself. "My name is Masha," she said with a smile, not hiding her friendliness. Masha believed that Princess Eisenbach was the most beautiful girl. However, today, looking at Rosika, she realized that someone could surpass her. This girl's beauty amazed everyone. The Duke remembered Masha as his nanny when he still lived in the imperial palace. 10 years had passed since then. He was only 15 then, and now he was back here, along with the bearded cook and her son. The cook had been the head chef at the palace, but 3 years ago he decided to move here. Masha constantly wondered why she continued to call him young master, despite the years that had passed. Masha noticed that the Duke showed no interest in women. This surprised her, as she hadn't expected him to invite a lady to his home, given everything she knew about him. The cook, smiling, said the Duke had never dated women. He'd even begun to think he had problems in that area and didn't know how to deal with it. The Duke grew angry and rudely retorted that the cook should shut up. Rosika, watching this scene, realized it wasn't that he wasn't interested in women, but rather that he was unwilling to open up. The Duke, with horror in his eyes, asked what she was thinking. Masha reassured him, noting that there was nothing unusual about it and that she understood everything perfectly. The chef couldn't help but laugh and said he still hoped the food was to his liking. His face expressed genuine concern, and he was looking for confirmation. Rosika replied that the food was indeed delicious. However, she added that she had a hard time understanding where the flavor came from, since she was simply cooking eggs. She also asked if she could try the dish His Highness ate. The Duke replied with a smile that, of course, it was lamb chops. Lord Raven was a great fan of these cutlets. He and Rexide, young gentlemen and peers, shared similar tastes, so they often ate together. Rosika paused to think about the name. She wondered how their lives were connected. If he'd grown up with Rexide in the Imperial Palace and they were the same age. If Rexide and the Duke were the same age and grew up together, then Rexide would be the first candidate for removal from the throne. This thought was not very encouraging. To ascend to the imperial throne, one had to become crown prince, which meant a power struggle. Rosika couldn't understand why this process was so convoluted. She was at a loss when she noticed Masha suddenly burst into tears. She couldn't understand what had happened or why it had affected her so much. The Duke turned to Marco, instructing him to calm Masha. He instructed him to take her out and return when everything was finished, leaving Rosika perplexed. Rosika remained where she was, lost in thought. She noticed that Marco and Masha clearly knew the Duke was planning something important, perhaps even revolutionary. The Duke, looking at her closely, said that her tears were not caused by what she thought. She wasn't crying because of what had happened, but he wanted to finish the meal first. When the meal was finished, he promised to explain to her exactly what her job entailed. It wasn't what she expected, but her curiosity was so strong that she was willing to listen. The previous emperor and empress had 4 children. The first was Robert van Hexen, now emperor, and the second was Reed van Hexen, Grand Duke. Both held important positions. The third daughter, Rachel Prania, was Duchess of Prania, enjoying a quiet life away from political intrigue. The fourth was Rexit van Hessen, Grand Duke, whose role had not yet been determined. Robert, the eldest son, took the throne with ease. This was expected as he was the heir apparent. He encountered no obstacles to his crown, and the empire accepted him without question. Raid, the second son, remained loyal to the emperor and actively helped strengthen the empire. He also worked to expand its territory, but did not aspire to the throne, as he had his role to play. Rachel, third in line, preferred to live a quiet life, not interfering in the affairs of state. Her life as a duchess was quiet and measured, and she made no attempt to change her position. Rexit was younger than his brothers and sister, but for some reason he decided to disrupt the peace. His ambitions were unusually strong, and he began to strive for power, which surprised many, including his family. Rexit dreamed of becoming emperor, and to do so, he needed to defeat two other contenders, the Crown Prince and Grand Duke Ride. It was a daunting task, but he was determined. However, the situation wasn't hopeless. The Grand Duke of Ride could be persuaded to abandon his claims if offered something in return, but this would require skillful manipulation. Ideally, Rexide hoped to avoid bloodshed and wanted Ride to voluntarily renounce his ambitions. He believed this would be the purest and most effective path to power. The Duke, however, was certain the task would be difficult even for her. He noted that Rexide was too ambitious to simply give up, and that it would take more to achieve his goal. The thing was, Rexide didn't just want to take the throne. He dreamed of getting rid of the Emperor and his family. His ambitions went far beyond a mere power struggle. However, the biggest problem remained the Crown Prince, who wasn't prepared to simply give up his position. The prince had the support of the people, and if Rexit decided to act, he would have to decide what to do with him. The girl immediately realized that in this case, certain precautions would need to be taken. For example, she could have seriously injured him, but fortunately there was no need for that. She entered the room and immediately felt how cold it was. There was an unusual chill in the air, immediately felt on her skin. The temperature in the room was maintained by magical stones that artificially lowered the heat, creating an unpleasant coolness for the body. The air also carried the distinctive scent of parsia, a substance used to prevent animal carcasses from rotting. It was typical of such places. She turned to the Duke, asking if she had understood his words correctly. He had just said that he did not consider it necessary to kill the Crown Prince. She wondered if that was truly true. The Duke removed the blanket from the bed, revealing the very same Crown Prince who, he explained, was already dead. This all made it clear that no further action was required. He confirmed that this was all because the Crown Prince was indeed dead. He explained that the question of his murder was no longer relevant, since he was no longer alive. They were both about the same age, and ever since he arrived at the palace, their lives had been intimately intertwined. Until then, they had relied on each other and shared much. He was a spoiled, soft child who saw him as his best friend, unaware that the Duke was hiding his true intentions and claws. The Crown Prince often traveled to Drax to meet him. These trips became a habit for him, and each time he sought out new experiences. And this time was no exception. He arrived, deciding that this was finally the chance he'd been waiting for. It was a momentous occasion for him. The girl understood exactly what he meant, but she became curious as to why he was lying. What was the Duke hiding that he had chosen to say that way? When she looked at him closely, she noticed that they really did look alike. The prince was intrigued by her impressions and asked what she thought of this resemblance. Rosika spent her entire life as a criminal, accustomed to cruelty and not considering it anything special. She was ready to reduce the Emperor's killer to nothing, and not feel the slightest regret or guilt. The Duke was certain the girl feared him, that her fears were forcing her to submit. He saw something similar in her eyes, but he lacked the confidence to understand her true feelings. However, the girl insisted that this wasn't true. She felt no fear of him. But the Duke confidently declared that it seemed she had finally realized that he could be trusted, or at least feared. When a deranged killer kidnapped her at the point of a knife to her friend's throat, Rosika found herself completely helpless. But her friend was innocent, and his life hung in the balance, and she could do nothing. She tried to object, asking for a chance to explain. However, the Duke merely apologized politely and said she couldn't escape, that she needed to understand and accept this harsh reality. Rosika was still trying to say something, but despite her efforts, no one listened to her words. She felt almost helpless, realizing that the time for conversation had long since passed. She turned to the Duke, asking him, did he really want her to be afraid of him? Wasn't he worried that she simply wouldn't believe him and would perceive his words as empty threats? Or perhaps his concern was that she didn't trust him from the start, and he was afraid in advance that her attitude towards him wouldn't change, that she would keep her distance. Come to think of it, she'd seen the Duke deceive others more than once. His sly glances and false words were familiar to her. She could tell exactly when he was telling the truth and when he was merely concealing his intentions. Rosika became a fraud not because her life was too hard, but because it was easier and more profitable for her to use her talents for deception and manipulation than to work honestly. From birth, she possessed a hidden ability that allowed her to sense people perfectly. She could instantly decipher their personality type and understand the kind of person hidden behind their appearance. Rosika had long since realized what the Duke was like, and if she was mistaken, it was only in one thing. She thought he yearned to become emperor. But, as it turned out, His ambitions were quite different, and she had been mistaken in her assessment. The Duke sighed heavily and asked again if she could repeat what she had just said. He was clearly unsure he had understood her words correctly and needed clarification. The girl noted that perhaps her words weren't precise enough. He didn't want to become emperor, as she had initially thought. In fact, his goal was revenge, and that was more important to him. The Duke laughed at her words and remarked that it was quite an interesting guess. He couldn't help but ask who she thought he might want to avenge. After all, it was already becoming curious. She replied that he probably desired revenge on the crown prince. The Duke paused and asked why she had decided so. He couldn't understand what could have led to such a thought. He explained that if his goal was the throne, it would be logical to kill the crown prince, since he was his main rival. Therefore, his interest in revenge struck her as odd, as if he wanted something else. The girl couldn't understand why he continued this pointless conversation, as if trying to confuse her. Her patience was wearing thin, and she noted with surprise that his logic was becoming increasingly irritating. The girl responded with restraint, that it could be compared to a situation where a buyer inspects an item before paying for it. She believed that when dealing with people, it was important to be cautious and evaluate them carefully. The Duke tried to justify himself, saying he hadn't meant anything of the sort, but the girl cut him off, explaining that when she meets someone, she immediately sizes them up to determine how trustworthy they are. And it's important to remember that every person is driven by some kind of desire, and at some point, it becomes stronger than reason. Even the most rational person can succumb to this temptation. If a person has a desire to win and be manipulated, their reason may prove weaker than that desire. This is a rather dangerous situation, as the person may act contrary to their common sense. And the lowest level is when a person is so weak that they are unable to resist their desires. They easily succumb to temptation, even if it clearly leads to error or downfall. Even though the main character is used to deceiving everyone without exception, there is one line she never crosses. This is her personal boundary, and she is not prepared to trifle with it. This point remains immutable for her. When the Duke asked what she was talking about, she explained that those who trust people, despite their cruelty and treachery, become easy prey even for those who aren't professional con artists. That's her point. Simply put, she doesn't deceive simpletons. She will only choose those who believe in good intentions if they have long since sold their conscience, betraying their own principles and morals. The situation has developed in such a way that even she is beginning to feel a sense of guilt she's never experienced before. This feeling seems strange and frightening to her, especially given her attitude toward people, even those in high positions. Rexed's personality is characterized by incredible kindness. He is always ready to show compassion, no matter the circumstances. The Duke, hearing her words, asked if she appreciated him, having known him for only a few days. She replied that this time was quite enough for her. Everything became clear when she looked at his actions, especially the way he treated her, a criminal sentenced to death. That was her answer. Rexed is truly a person who is infinitely kind to his people, yet capable of acting without hesitation when it comes to protecting those he trusts. He is prepared to take decisive action if it means something to those he cares about. Moreover, he believes he can always count on those around him. Although he recognizes that he easily trusts people, he continues to do so, relying on his intuition and desire to believe in the good. The Duke tries to establish a trusting relationship with the girl, thinking that this will help him win her over. He advises her to hire his butler to help, but she refuses to believe him. On top of that, he's confident that by revealing his despotic nature to her, he can gain her respect. If the Duke were capable of killing innocents other than the prince, he would have risen long ago and brought her the heads of Masha and Marco. She's convinced there must be no traces left, and she believes the Duke wouldn't be capable of such a thing. She believes he won't take the lives of innocent people. These thoughts are certain in her heart. She believes he shouldn't show his strength because it doesn't suit him. He's surprised that she trusts him and doesn't believe the rumors about his murder of the crown prince, considering them lies. The girl noticed that, despite his declaration that he aspired to become emperor, she saw no clear reason for it. He never said what he would do after achieving his goal, but now she seemed to understand. The Duke has no pity, no greed, no clear purpose in life. But after the death of someone close to him, who was killed by the crown prince, he had only one goal: revenge. His goal became clear, a month she remembers well. She knows he was the one who killed that man, but those around him know nothing about it, which gives him additional power. It was the death of the first in line to the throne of the empire, the crown prince, and his death was a momentous event that led to a great change in the Duke's life, setting him on the path of revenge. So far, no one except the one who killed Crown Prince Raven and the other people in this vast castle knew of his death. The entire court and servants remained completely unaware of what had happened. Yet somehow Raven's body ended up in Rexide's possession. This added to the mystery as no one had seen it since the prince's death. Questions about how it came to be in the Duke's possession remained unanswered. In such a situation, all suspicion will likely be directed at you. This will help clear Rexide of the false accusations of the Crown Prince's murder and direct attention to the true culprits. After all, this was precisely the task Rexide had entrusted to her from the very beginning. He knew she could handle it, and he hoped her actions would help prove his innocence. He lived quietly, remaining in the shadows. As the palace was concerned his actions would damage the family's image, he was then ordered to a distant border as punishment for his actions. He lived a quiet life, doing his utmost to preserve the imperial family's clear name. However, when he returned, tragedy awaited him. The death of his best friend, the Crown Prince, and a murder charge. Rosica will face grave problems if he is accused of murder and executed before he can become emperor. In that case, all his efforts will be in vain, and his fate will be sealed. She noticed that his life was in danger and asked if he understood what she was saying. Her words were loaded with meaning, but she hoped he would understand the gravity of the situation. She tried to reassure him, telling him not to worry. She was confident that everything would be fine, despite all the difficulties. And he still had a chance to make things right. The Duke was surprised and looked at her with obvious bewilderment. He hadn't expected this from her. Though she was always confident in her actions, her words put him in a difficult position. But the girl simply said that she always earns her keep. And in that moment, she demonstrated her determination and confidence that she can handle any situation. As the girl walked down the corridor, Owen grabbed her and asked who she was. His gaze was wary, trying to figure out who dared to walk so calmly through the palace. He demanded an explanation for how she ended up in these corridors, all the while holding her at risk. He was prepared to take action to learn everything about her until he got the information he needed. The girl was surprised when she saw the butler. She hadn't expected to find him in such a state, but she remained calm. The situation was difficult, and she needed to be prepared. The Duke, seeing this scene, was also perplexed. He looked at the butler with obvious confusion. Not understanding why he was acting this way, his voice took on a harsh tone as he shouted at the servant. Owen tried to justify himself, claiming there had been a mistake. The Duke approached the girl and asked if she was okay, trying to figure out what was going on. The girl said everything was fine and noted that the Duke was genuinely worried about her. He was always so attentive and caring, and her calm couldn't help but reassure him. The butler noted that the Duke couldn't simply dismiss someone who had so unexpectedly burst into his room early in the morning. Of course, he couldn't remain indifferent. It was too strange. The Duke was about to strike the butler for his words, but he simply sighed and smiled, as if it were all unimportant. He was prepared for any consequences and didn't perceive the situation as a threat. The butler apologized, explaining that it had all been an instinctive reaction. He sincerely regretted his actions and hoped the girl hadn't been offended. It had been an accidental misunderstanding. The lady said everything was fine, as it was a perfectly obvious reaction, something one would expect from anyone in a similar situation. There were no hard feelings or complaints. Everything was normal and solvable. When he was studying at the assassin school, the most dangerous assassins were on the girl's person. They were all so fragile and beautiful that their abilities made even the most experienced people afraid. The girl asked again, referring to a hired killer, and he confirmed that was exactly what he had in mind. He even recalled those people who slept with a knife under their pillow, but they were all powerless against his classmates. He assumed she found it surprising too, so he distrusted beautiful women. Despite their appearance, his experience taught him to be cautious and not to trust outward signs, even if they could be deceiving. The Viper said she'd always known he was an extraordinary man. His past was truly grand and full of dangers, which couldn't help but leave an impression. The butler was amazed that such a beautiful stranger had ended up in His Majesty's castle. He thought she might forgive him, but she replied that he should have been praised for his insight. She wasn't offended, and his actions seemed entirely justified to her. His Highness's life had become hers, and she hoped the Duke would continue to care for him in the future, maintaining his care and attention. However, she felt no need to worry about that. The butler apologized for the rudeness of his questions, but he wanted to make sure the person before him was genuine. The Duke approached and confirmed that this was indeed the man they had been expecting. He'd already checked this information. The girl admitted she'd thought her cheeks would be torn off by such a misunderstanding, but it turned out everything was fine. It was a pleasant surprise for her. The Duke asked again if she had any enemies and if anyone might be displeased with her actions. He wanted to make sure she was not in danger, knowing she might have encountered danger. The girl answered this question with a grin. It was a truly stupid question, given her background in the world of fraud. She could name so many enemies she wouldn't have enough on her fingers. The girl noticed that this was true, but still asked why he was asking such questions. The Duke replied that it was necessary to prevent any threats and kill them before they could take her life. She couldn't understand the source of this sudden aggression. She knew him as a man who wasn't so cruel as to solve problems by killing, especially indiscriminately. It seemed strange. She reminded him again that only the victims of her deception could displease her. But that didn't matter to the Duke. He wanted her to talk, and he learned a great deal about her past, which greatly changed his perception of her. The Duke was certain this wasn't her first time in such a situation. He saw the experience in her eyes, which suggested she'd faced danger many times before. The girl asked him why he was so sure, and he replied that he was convinced by the expression on her face when the knife was held to her throat. That expression spoke for itself. It didn't resemble the face of a confused person. It was as if she'd experienced the shock of imminent death many times, and it showed. She smiled slightly, realizing that her behavior had triggered such thoughts. She truly had been shocked by many deaths. She admitted that she had, in fact, died this way more than once, whatever that meant. The fear and pain of death were familiar to her, and it was part of her past. She said she was safe now, and they didn't have to worry. Those who had threatened her life were no longer alive, and no one knew her true identity anymore. From that day on, they became her only protection. 4 people, including the Duke, were now her protectors. With these 4, there was no need to worry about her safety, as they were ready to deal with any threat. Viper, or Rosika, knew she had a tough job ahead of her to complete the task assigned to her. She didn't even have a day to complete it, but she was ready for it. One of the men, noticing her wound, asked how she was feeling and offered to go to his room to treat it. He promised to help with the treatment, concerned about her health. He knew how to treat simple injuries, but the girl steadfastly refused his help. She was confident she could handle such a wound on her own, without needing outside assistance. After thanking him for his concern, Viper left his room and headed to her own quarters. She preferred to leave all her troubles behind and return to her familiar world. Her face was beautiful, and that surprised no one. She was a true beauty, whose face would be remembered by anyone who ever looked at her. It was her authentic, natural face. The Duke, noticing her beauty, suddenly exclaimed, asking what good he had done to deserve such a compliment. He couldn't understand why they called her a beauty. In response, the Duke loudly protested, asking where his intelligence had gone that he had become so naive and unable to notice the obvious. His bewilderment was palpable. At this point, the Crown Prince, standing next to Rexide, noticed that he had once said he envied people like them. He couldn't forget these words and addressed the Duke with them. Rexide, hearing his words, asked who exactly he was looking at when he spoke like that. He was clearly interested in his answer, trying to understand what exactly he was talking about. The Duke continued that he likely wasn't referring to the poor inhabitants of their lands who toiled day after day to feed themselves. These people were in difficult circumstances, but they worked to survive. However, the Crown Prince expressed his own point of view. He actually envied these people. They were free, unlike those forced to live constantly worrying about how they appeared to others. They are not obligated to follow strict and boring rules of etiquette, nor should they point their swords at those they love and cherish, regardless of the circumstances. Such a life is not for them. It limits their freedom. He said they could sleep peacefully without worrying about their safety, but Rexide asked why his friend couldn't sleep so peacefully. Perhaps someone had told him they would kill him, and that was worrying him? If so, he was ready to tear him to pieces. However, the prince asked Rexide to listen to him carefully. He said that he was truly going through a very difficult time, and now he needed to figure out what exactly was bothering him. He was sure he was still holding up well, but lately it had become increasingly difficult for him to cope. This feeling was becoming unbearable. He sensed something was wrong and couldn't find a way out. Rexide didn't understand what was happening to him. All he could do was listen attentively, but everything seemed completely strange and absurd. He didn't know what was going on in his friend's soul at that moment. He said his friend was just being a fool. He'd gotten too big for his boots, and all this worrying was a waste of time. He needed to learn to cope with difficulties instead of worrying about everything. Rexide continued, saying that if his friend had lived like ordinary people, he wouldn't have lasted a day. He would have immediately fled back to the cozy palace, to his comfortable life, without any hardships. The guy thanked him for these words and admitted that he felt the time had come. Time to move on, despite all the difficulties. He decided it was time to leave this stage of his life. And yet, despite their differences, they hadn't seen each other for a long time. And when they did meet, their hearts felt lighter. Sometimes it's these encounters that help you see life from a different perspective, even if only temporarily. If only he had a slightly more gentle and patient nature. Perhaps then his life would have been easier, and he could have more quickly rid himself of the inner burdens that weighed so heavily on him. Rex had never understood why his friend had behaved so stupidly, why he hadn't asked him what was bothering him, and how he could help. It would have been so simple, to support him, to understand his plight. But it was too late now. Raven was dead. No, not just gone, he was killed, and now all that remained was the realization that nothing could be done for their friendship. It was all over. The man didn't bother to inquire about his master's plans next. Time was precious, and they didn't have much of it. They had to act quickly to complete all their tasks. If the crown prince who is on vacation remains out of contact for a long time, the imperial court will likely quickly realize that something is wrong with his absence and that the situation needs to be addressed immediately. The Duke assured her she would find a solution and promised that everything would be done. He also informed her that she had expressed interest in Raven's handwriting, so he gave her several letters they had exchanged. Now the butler finally understood what the girl had been carrying out of his room. However, he became curious about the purpose of these letters and began to wonder what she was using them for and how it connected to her plans. The Duke admitted he didn't know what exactly was going on. He was so foolish that he'd been forced to hire a con artist, but he still warned against trusting the Viper too much and always asking for clarification on her actions. He also added that, if possible, one should only speak to the girl in the presence of the butler, so that he could closely monitor her words and actions without missing any important details. The Duke, despite everything that was happening, assured that even if he trusted everyone in the world, he should never trust anyone, because this woman made him afraid and wary. Nevertheless, the girl was pleasantly surprised by the new name the Duke had given her. Rosica was a beautiful name, and she was delighted that for the first time someone had chosen hers with such warmth and meaning. She decided to cherish that name and be grateful for such an honor, even though the Duke continued to assure Owen he would never trust her. He still remembered her despite all his doubts and fears. As she said, she always earned her worth, and that made him smile. Perhaps it meant he'd broken his word, but he couldn't deny that her behavior sometimes commanded respect. The girl wished everyone good night, and the Duke turned to the Viper, not forgetting to remind her of the importance of her next step and her role in the upcoming events. The girl, slightly irritated, asked how long the Duke intended to call her that. She was sure that if anyone heard her, they would immediately assume she was a criminal or a fraud, as her nickname aroused suspicion. The butler nodded, acknowledging her point, noting that such nicknames hardly promoted a good reputation. So he decided to clarify what he should call her so as not to raise unnecessary questions. The Duke calmly replied that her real name was Rosica. The girl, slightly surprised, immediately asked why there were no servants in this enormous palace, since its size at least suggested a staff. The Duke, pursing his lips, explained that there had always been only 4 people in this palace: the maid Masha, her son, the butler himself, and of course, himself. No one else was needed here, due to their personal preferences. He added that he didn't need anyone's help, as he preferred his home to be quiet and peaceful. The girl, slightly mockingly, asked why he didn't hire servants, given the castle's size and its emptiness. She pointed out that the palace was indeed enormous, but it felt empty and uninviting. There would have to be at least 50 people there for there to be any movement, as the castle was too large to be so quiet. The Duke was stunned by this proposal. The girl, wasting no time, began listing how the kitchen needed at least 10 people, cleaning another 10, laundry also required 10, and another 10 to manage it all. The butler, a little embarrassed, tried to explain that the palace was indeed large, but not so large as to require such a massive amount of service. He reminded the guests that the Duke, as always, disliked crowds and could not stand noise. However, the Duke, without losing patience, interrupted him. He ordered that everything be done according to the girl's suggestion. The remaining 10 servants were to be chosen from the lower nobility, and servants for more important duties were also to be selected. She wanted him to somehow achieve a title that suited her. That was her plan, but she was sure it would take time and effort. She hoped he would understand her intentions. There's nothing to be done. She has a lot of work to do to make His Majesty a true emperor. She can't remain in the shadows forever. Eventually, she'll need to step forward to take control. To do this, she needs the necessary authority to decide important issues and pave the way forward. Dvoretsky was curious and asked her what specifically she intended to do, what required such authority and effort. The girl replied that she hadn't decided on this matter yet and needed more time to think it over. This was an important step, and she couldn't make a hasty decision without thinking through all the details. After all, she'd been working with a back-alley thug, and now it seemed she'd be working with the man who would become emperor. He thought she could quickly formulate a plan, but she wasn't so sure. She was always suspicious, and that was her main quality. No matter what plan she talked about, she always remained cautious and wary. Perhaps she simply wanted everyone to think she'd caught a simpleton. He heard that she had taken His Majesty's letters yesterday. This prompted him to ask how she intended to use these documents and what exactly she planned to do with them in the future. The girl replied sarcastically that if he continued talking to her so much, she'd soon experience indigestion. She wasn't in the mood for long conversations, especially when they were starting to bore her. The gentleman remarked that she was right. He really was chatty today, like a parrot. This was clearly uncharacteristic of him, and it was probably worth giving her some peace and quiet so she could get on with her business. The Duke declared that they were back at the table and that he did not need to finish his meal right now, because he could always ask his questions later, at another time, when it would be more convenient for everyone. But the girl, without losing her composure, replied that if he was so interested, he could come to her later when she was in her room. Then he could find out everything that was bothering him. The butler was silent for a moment, pondering her words. Then he said he understood her perfectly and agreed with the proposal. There was a hint of thoughtfulness in his tone. He noted that a lot of money had been spent on her, and therefore every detail needed to be carefully checked. He couldn't just trust her, suspecting she might be hiding something important. The butler headed for her room, anticipating what awaited him there. When he entered, the girl was already lying on the bed, giving him away in her own way, once again demonstrating her composure. He thought her behavior might be a result of the recent knife incident. Perhaps she was upset, or perhaps she was doing all this on purpose to provoke a reaction or confuse him. Rosika smiled and suddenly said, "You said you were an assassin." Her words were spoken with a hint of sarcasm, but there was a hint of interest in them, as if she were trying to understand him better. He replied with pride that he could handle any situation quickly and intelligently, and that his speech was always well structured. He considered his dexterity an important quality in life. The butler, slightly surprised by her remark, decided to take it as a compliment. Then the girl, noticing his reaction, raised her head slightly and looked at him with a slight challenge in her eyes. The next moment she asked him about his height, and he replied that he was 182 centimeters. Then came the unexpected question. What about your weight? He couldn't understand why she needed this information. The girl continued, noting that if he wanted to look perfect, he needed to lose another 3 kilograms or so. Her words were spoken with a hint of irony, but with a clear interest in his appearance. He chuckled and declared that he was quite happy with his figure and saw no point in making any changes. Hearing this, Rosika smiled faintly as if enjoying his answer. She said with an undisguised smile that after they finished their business, he would have to gain some weight again. Her words were cryptic, but they sounded like they were planned. The butler, clearly perplexed, asked what exactly she meant when she said they had to finish. He didn't understand what she was talking about, and her words only confused him further. The girl insisted that he undress, and she made this quite bluntly. She ordered him to comply with her request without asking unnecessary questions, as is usually the case in such situations. At this time, the Duke was in his library. She couldn't understand why he wasn't there yet. There were so many books and papers in his room that everything blended together, making it difficult to find anything specific. He thought he needed to clean up his room. There was too much clutter, and even he, accustomed to disorder, was beginning to notice how it was interfering with his normal work. This needed to be addressed. The Duke searched the table for something, but his efforts were fruitless. He flipped through papers and moved books but found nothing suitable. It seemed as if all traces of the object had vanished. Recalling her words, he realized she was interested in the Crown Prince's letters. She said that if he had any such letters, she would be pleased to receive them, as she very much wanted to see them. Glancing at the other desk, he picked up a few papers and realized he had no one else to correspond with. It was strange, because just recently there had been a lot of letters, but now everything had somehow calmed down. The Duke picked up several letters and began to read. One of them stated that spring had apparently already arrived. Tulips were blooming in the palace garden, symbolizing a declaration of love. Raven also mentioned in the letter that he thought Rek'Sai didn't understand how hard it was to expect such sensuality from him. This wasn't the first thought he'd expressed about his friend. He wrote that when men fall in love, they often give tulips. It was a declaration of love, always accompanied by these flowers, and a sign of special significance for both parties. Raven continued that until his dying day he'd like to see Rex do the same, give tulips when he confesses. He hoped the letter would arrive soon and everything would be all right. But he couldn't understand why he, of all people, had to go to a small kingdom to suppress a rebellion. It was a strange mission, and it didn't meet his expectations. The letter also spoke of Raven's eagerness to see his friend. He felt that to meet someone as important as Rek'Sai, he should make the journey himself, rather than wait for him to arrive. He assured her he'd be on his way soon and would try to tell Rex a lot. This was a significant event, and he felt the long-awaited meeting would give their relationship new meaning. Raven also asked how Rex was doing. He sincerely hoped he was okay, as not only his own fate but the fate of many others depended on it. In his final letter, he shared his thoughts on age. He wrote that the older he grew, the more confused he became about his feelings. The world around him seemed to be changing, and this greatly troubled him. He deeply missed the days when he and his brother Raven lived in the Imperial Palace. Those were the moments when they felt part of a great family and had each other's constant support. During those times, he often asked Rex how he was coping with the responsibilities he'd taken on. This was important to both of them, as every day at the palace was filled with events and responsibilities. But over time, the Duke began to experience strange moments. He began hallucinating as if his brother were nearby, writing him letters telling him of his suffering and difficulties. In one of these letters, he discovered blurred drops, like tears. These were words full of pain and emotion. The Duke poured his heart into these lines, describing how difficult it was for him to be without the support of a loved one. Rex had pondered how to respond to such a letter. He felt every line was important, and he didn't know how to express his feelings in response, to support his brother in this difficult moment. He opened another letter, but he wasn't sure it was truly from Ray. His heart was pounding, unsure how to process these strange and disturbing messages. Prince Raven's letter said he was no longer suffering or sad. He was happy, but he worried that his friend was alone. He hoped he would find solace, even if he wasn't there. The Duke was utterly horrified as he read the letter. It said his friend shouldn't grieve his death for long because Raven wished him happiness and wanted him to live a full life. The prince asked his friend to be happy for the next 2 days, until they met again. These words were so eloquent that the Duke couldn't help but wonder what was really going on. Rexid was certain this letter was written by his brother Raven. He knew his handwriting and style. The feelings expressed in the letter were too familiar to be a mistake. He was absolutely certain these words came from Raven. It was impossible to imagine anyone else writing with such sincerity and such deep emotion. At that moment, the door swung open and Rozika walked in. She was shocked by what she saw, and her face reflected unimaginable amazement when she saw the letter. She immediately turned to His Highness and, noticing the expression on his face, realized something important had happened. Rozika was shocked by everything that was happening. Rek'Sai turned to face her, his expression filled with fear. He was clearly frightened. It was clear he was worried and unsure how to react to everything happening around him. He asked her with concern how she had managed to obtain this letter. He couldn't understand how she could have ended up in this place, and how it was possible that she was holding such important words in her hands. He begged Rozika to tell him how and when she received this letter. His eyes were filled with fear, because hidden within these lines were the answers to questions he couldn't find himself. Rexid persisted, asking her to explain her connection to the letter. His voice was thick with worry, desperate for clarification. Rozika glanced at the letter, and the butler remarked that she was truly incredible. He couldn't understand how she had gotten herself into this situation, or what she was going to do about it. She turned to the butler and asked him to give her a minute. She felt she needed a little time to process everything that had happened and decide what to do next. The butler, for his part, believed the letter needed to be sent to the Imperial Palace as quickly as possible. He understood the importance of this message, but he didn't know what was actually about to happen. He was surprised that Rek'Sai was here, in this place. But he was even more surprised that the gentleman looked more tense and agitated than ever before. The butler couldn't understand why Rek'Sai had such a tense look. He sensed something important and alarming was about to happen, but he didn't know what it was. Rozika sighed heavily, and the butler suddenly remembered something important. He began to suspect that this moment could be decisive in the fate of everyone involved in this strange affair. The butler, with some excitement, said that the gentleman must definitely take a look at this letter, as it was simply astonishing. He couldn't figure out exactly where it came from, but the impression it made was powerful. The butler also looked closely at himself in the mirror and was surprised. He hadn't expected such a reaction, but strangely enough, the Duke suddenly approached him and hugged him tightly, which puzzled him even more. The Duke continued to think it was a chance, a possibility that the Crown Prince had truly returned, even though everyone around him knew it was almost impossible. But apparently he was so confident that he believed in a miracle. However, despite all his doubts, the Duke was more willing to believe in a miracle than to seek a rational explanation for what was happening. He was convinced that this was precisely the moment when the incredible became reality. He casually addressed the butler as Raven, but the butler smiled and said that wasn't true. He wasn't His Highness, and he couldn't accept such an address despite the strangeness of the situation. A female voice suddenly spoke from behind, and the girl standing there declared that it was indeed not the Crown Prince. She was certain of her assertion and clearly had no intention of letting the Duke be mistaken. The Duke, shocked and confused, laughed nervously, tears in his eyes, trying to hide his feelings. He didn't know how to react, but everything that was happening was getting on his nerves. He acknowledged that this was indeed true, but he still couldn't understand where the letter had come from. His doubts and worries continued to grow, and the question remained unanswered. The Duke was certain the letter had been written by Raven himself. He continued to believe this, despite the absurdity of the situation, and didn't even want to consider how it could have been otherwise. But the girl, patiently and calmly, said that she had written it. She was the only one who could help, and she had done so to support the Duke in his aspirations. She explained that in order to help him, she had to copy the Crown Prince's handwriting, as that was the only way she could approach the problem. She did all this with the best of intentions. With a sincere apology, she added that she had not intended to offend him. She had not expected it to provoke such emotions in the Duke, and she was prepared to apologize for any possible misunderstanding. The Duke, after a few seconds of reflection, understood her. He sighed deeply, as if relieved, and without further ado, tossed the letter to the floor, forgetting all the worries it had caused. That evening, standing on the balcony, he smoked a cigar, lost in thought. The butler, noticing his habit, reminded him that he had quit smoking long ago, but now it was the only thing that helped him cope. Today, the owner decided to resume his habits, immersing himself in old affairs. His attention was riveted on something important, and he couldn't be distracted, despite everything going on around him. The butler, observing his behavior, couldn't resist asking what had prompted her to write such a letter. He realized it had come as a great surprise to him, almost a shock. She admitted that she now regrets this action. At the time, she wanted to see if she could forge handwriting so skillfully as to deceive even His Majesty himself. Looking back now, she realized it had been an unnecessary action. At the time, she hadn't imagined that it would all be beyond her control and become such a crucial part of events. She and the Crown Prince were born in the same year in the Imperial Palace and spent their entire childhood together, socializing, playing, and exploring the world. This brought them closer together, and they became inseparable friends from a very early age. When the Master came to the lands of Drax, the Crown Prince, despite his busy schedule, visited them frequently. These visits always brought joy and excitement to their homes, strengthening the friendship between them. Their relationship was always marked by sincerity and respect. This was evident in the frequent exchange of letters, in which they were open about their feelings and thoughts, trusting each other more than anyone else. When the Crown Prince died, the Master, in deep shock, sank into apathy. A strange coincidence. It all happened right on the way to the Draxlands, for which he was responsible. The lady believed that what had happened was part of someone's carefully planned intrigue, aimed at accusing His Majesty of the murder of the Crown Prince, disrupting everything they had built for so long. The butler noted that, at first, this hadn't bothered him much. He was consumed by inner turmoil, and false accusations or other problems couldn't distract him from his condition. He was out of his mind, as if lost in his thoughts and emotions. Today, despite his outward calm, the situation hadn't changed much, and he remained just as depressed. He continued to pretend everything was fine, hiding his pain. But his face and actions spoke otherwise. He couldn't forget the death of his friend, who had once been close to him. The butler asked her if she knew why the Master often stood in front of this birch tree. He remarked that it was a habit that had become ingrained in him, and it couldn't help but spark her interest. The girl didn't know the answer, so she asked. The butler explained that when he first arrived here, this birch tree was the first gift the Crown Prince brought for his friend, the owner. It was a young birch sapling, and he knew it had been planted here as a symbol of something new, perhaps for both of them. This moment felt like a new chapter in their lives. The butler turned to the lady and said that she seemed to be unable to handle the sapling because she was tormented by remorse. It was evident on her face. She felt uncomfortable. It was strange because she'd previously been a fraudster, ruining entire families for her own gain. She never considered the consequences of her actions, nor did she care about the misfortunes of others. She spent other people's fortunes as if it were her right, even if they were earned through sweat and blood. All she wanted was to earn more, and she didn't consider the morality of her actions. But now that she was faced with real remorse, it was a completely new experience for her. She didn't know what it meant. Something inside her suddenly shifted, and she felt uneasy. It was a completely unfamiliar feeling. She'd never experienced anything like it, and she found it difficult to understand what was happening to her. It was like an awakening, and she couldn't find an explanation. The Duke continued to calmly smoke his cigarette until the Viper, as he called her, approached him. He looked at her with interest, not surprised by her appearance. The Duke asked what she wanted and threw his cigarette to the ground. But the Viper said he didn't need to quit smoking for her. She had no intention of interfering with his habits. However, he replied that he didn't want to smoke anymore and asked what had possessed her to go outside on such a cold night, especially in such a light dress. It was strange. Despite the coldness, she replied that everything was happening because she hadn't been able to apologize to him properly. It was a sincere confession, not just words, but real emotion. She simply wanted to apologize and explain that she hadn't meant to make fun of him. He replied that he knew that and that his behavior wasn't out of anger, but rather because she needed to get back into the warmth. She remained silent, but he expressed his concern again, adding that perhaps she thought he might not be able to function properly if he had a cold. It made no sense, of course, but his words carried a caustic undertone. The girl remained silent again. He looked at her with obvious disdain, not understanding why she was silent or what she was feeling. It all irritated him, but he didn't pursue the conversation further. In the end, he decided to do things his own way. He took off his cloak and offered to put it on instead of standing in the cold. It was a thoughtful gesture, despite its severity. She began to talk about the Crown Prince, wondering what he might do if he were next to his friend now, and what exactly he would say in response to his actions at such a moment. Deep down, she thought that perhaps this would be the last time he would say these very words to his friend, and it would be his last gesture of attention and care. If her words had upset him in any way, she sincerely regretted it, as that had not been her intention. She was ready to apologize if they might have upset him. He responded with a slight smile, looking up at the sky. He said everything was fine and it didn't bother him, trying to reassure her and show her that everything was under control. The girl tried again to explain that she was truly sorry if her words had caused any unpleasant emotions. She didn't want to leave him in that state, but he, unwilling to continue the conversation, simply clutched everything in his hands and said that, in fact, she was still better than him. These words sounded without unnecessary emotion, as if detached. They had never met or spoken, but she felt she knew him far better than he knew himself. She saw how he worried and could understand him without words. She was sure Raven had probably cried when he wrote his last letter, and that's exactly what she felt, even without seeing him. There was a special connection to him in her heart. She lowered her eyes, unsure of what to say. Her thoughts were confused, her feelings deep. She didn't want to say anything more, but it was hard to remain silent. Then he began to laugh. His laughter wasn't malicious, but rather relieved, as if he'd finally realized he'd forgotten to answer the letter the girl had mentioned. He added that, in fact, he wasn't the only one who felt this way about Raven. He realized he hadn't tried to understand him or comfort him. He was too preoccupied with himself. The girl asked what the Crown Prince was really like, what his image concealed. She sought answers, understanding that there is more to every person than meets the eye. The Duke thought about his friend, whom he considered almost a brother, and often recalled the moments he spent with him. It was Raven, and for him, this man was a significant figure, despite their differences. Raven van Hexen, the Duke's older brother, was his best friend. Despite his superior status, their relationship was as if they were peers and shared much. Although Raven sometimes seemed like a younger brother the Duke wanted to protect, his features were soft and gentle. Raven was a kind man, often displaying a vulnerability that was obvious to all. He cried often, which was not surprising for the Duke. From his letters, one could see how emotional Raven was, who did not hide his feelings and experiences. Rexid's mother died shortly after his birth, and he grew up without true parental warmth and care. This left a mark on his life, and he always felt a lack of this essential love. Unlike Rexid, Raven had an empress who acted as a mother figure, supporting him, something that made his friend envious. Rexid always envied this, as he had never experienced anything like it. Though Raxt tried to hide his feelings, he was perfectly aware that his friend was jealous. He noticed it in the way Raven was always surrounded by care, unlike him. When Raven was still a child, at the age of 6, he began calling his father Emperor. This expression of respect was his way of understanding his place in the world, his connection to power. Raven's mother called her Her Majesty the Empress, as was the custom. Raven was surprised to hear that Raven had begun doing so at such a young age and pondered the meaning of the words. The Duke laughed, noting that Raven probably simply felt sorry for Rexide. He also added that Raven was terrified of his father, the previous emperor, and always tried to please him. Even when Raven was scolded, he couldn't stand idly by. He always confessed his mistakes so that they would share the blame, and he often cried over it. They said he lied when he claimed it was he who suggested his friends skip class and go play. However, this was an important point. Sometimes it's better to be together than to engage in useless nonsense. The girl asked what it was about that sentence that could be difficult. The gentleman replied that his friend was incredibly kind and always there for him when he needed support. He didn't know how exactly he knew this, but he always sensed when something was bothering him. And whenever he was having trouble, he could talk about it with him, and that brought relief. It was amazing. When you think about it, Raven never left him alone. His constant support and attention were like an anchor in his turbulent world, giving him the strength to endure any trials. Rex had never felt a burden, confident in his own strength and ability to protect his friend. But as it turned out, he was mistaken in thinking that force alone could solve everything. Despite all his resilience, Rexide couldn't hide his inner fear and pain. He was on edge, but even in these moments when he needed support, there was no one to comfort him. When his friend died, Rexide didn't know what exactly could help him at that moment. So, determined to understand what was troubling him most, he asked the girl what was troubling her about the matter. He thought it would be better if his friend hated him like that foolish Raven. After all, Raven couldn't bear the pain of loss, much less hurt someone else. He was too vulnerable himself. The girl agreed with his opinion. Crown Prince Raven was indeed the kind of person who preferred to hide his feelings, not showing true pain, leaving others to think that he was invincible. She thought that if Raven knew he had someone who could understand his pain and struggles, he might be a little more open and honest about his feelings. She could be that person. In the days leading up to his death, she understood how much pain Raven was going through. His friend's death had left a deep wound within him, and she could understand how hard it was for him to bear that burden, what was truly causing his suffering. She would have tried to comfort him, to find the right words to help him cope. But Rexide, having lost his friend, continued to struggle with himself, but his mind and soul were in turmoil. Rexide continued to act strangely and awkwardly, as if he were losing his mind with grief. The girl, noticing this, suggested they wait. She noticed dust getting into his eyes and decided that perhaps this had upset him. She gently wiped away his tears and told him that he should rather think that His Majesty, the Crown Prince, had always wished her only happiness and continued to wish the same at this moment. After all, the Crown Prince, as a kind and gentle man, would never wish for anyone to take revenge for him, since revenge would only lead to greater suffering. He, however, began to say something, trying to justify his feelings. But the girl quickly interrupted him, declaring that she categorically disagreed with his thoughts. She didn't intend to convince him to give up his revenge, but she certainly wanted him to stop blaming himself for the man's death. She offered him to fulfill the Crown Prince's last wish so that he could find peace in his soul and find peace. The Crown Prince's wish was clear. The Duke had to be happy, and she was going to help him achieve this. If Rexide's heart can only be calmed by doing something with him, then she is willing to help, promising to find a way to make him happy. If he decides to catch the criminal and lock him up forever, she's ready to help him. And if he wants to fulfill the Crown Prince's cherished wish, she'll be there too. This is precisely why she was by his side. There is nothing she wouldn't do to achieve his goal. Lady Rosica has been given the title typically accorded to Duke Drax's immediate family. It is that of Princess, and she will be first in line to succeed the head of the Drax family. Initially, the title was intended to go to either the Duke's sister or his daughter, but fate decreed otherwise. This was an unexpected turn of events, as other family members were awaiting the choice. However, Duke Rexide himself, known for his decisiveness, declared that he would do as he decided. And although the girl objected, he couldn't understand why she was so opposed to this decision. For the Duke, this decision made no sense, as he didn't think it would have any impact on the girl. After all, after she helped him become emperor, she might have to return to her former work. He guessed there was another reason for her displeasure, but she still said that it all seemed too strange to her. She couldn't understand how a new successor had suddenly appeared, and it all seemed incredibly confusing. Especially since the chosen candidate was someone who spent most of the year on the battlefield. And, what's more, she wasn't a man, but a woman. This seemed completely absurd, and her background in general seemed dubious. This decision raised many questions, as it left everyone wondering what exactly Duke Rexide was planning. But in his eyes, appointing a woman as his heir was a logical step. The whole world knew the Duke had no interest in marriage, but not in the imperial palace, where its own rules and dogmas reigned. This fact was well known among the nobility, but remained a secret to most. It's no surprise that the Duke not only had no interest in marriage, but even avoided it. He was considered a man who had never entered into a union, meaning he had an undisputed successor, which removed many questions. Everyone around would probably think that the owner, who doesn't tolerate unnecessary fuss and prefers minimalism, chose the most obvious color for her. But she believes that's exactly it. It's a logical choice. When His Majesty, a man accustomed to life on the battlefield, unexpectedly appointed a woman as his successor, it raised eyebrows. To those around him, it looked like an attempt to smooth things over and simply close the matter. The butler noted that this was entirely possible, although he believed appointing a woman as successor was too hasty. It might well suit the Archduke, who is not inclined to waste time on unnecessary reflection and details. In any case, this is the version they will be spreading to the public. John also noted that the title Princess would be most appropriate for her new role, as that is precisely what she represents in their eyes. He felt the tension, realizing the full gravity of what would come next. After all, when all this was completed, he intended to drive her out of the family, leaving her with no significant status or rights. After he himself becomes emperor, he will offer her the opportunity to regain the title if she so desires. But this will be at his discretion, and her position in this matter will depend solely on his decision. It was quite a tempting offer, as the title of princess was perhaps the safest place for her in the current circumstances. Behind it lay the power that would ensure her safety. She agreed without hesitation and then signed all the necessary documents, realizing that her fate would now depend on this decision and the title she would receive. In gratitude for all he had done, she asked him to take care of her and, as a sign of special affection, called him Daddy, which was another step in their relationship. He choked, and the girl didn't immediately understand what had happened. He choked on hearing her use the word daddy, which clearly confused him. It was a word clearly not part of his usual vocabulary. The girl noticed that the age difference between them was only 4 years. Sometimes she felt like she was going a bit overboard, trying to talk to him like he was older. Perhaps she should start calling him little brother, she thought. It would be more age-appropriate and would cause far less confusion on his part. He groaned again, and the girl noticed his face had turned bright red. He looked like he wanted to sink into the ground, embarrassed, trying to comprehend what had happened. Rex van Hessen was third in line to the throne, and his influence on key political circles was undoubtedly great. Rumors, intrigues, and important meetings always surrounded him. He was not only smart but also strong, though he often seemed rather simple-minded. She thought he had muscle in his brain too, and that he knew how to fight not only with words but also on the battlefield. She also noted in the letter that he was a bonfire, but as soon as he noticed, she quickly began erasing the words, realizing he might not like them. A slight irony remained in her mind. She assumed the palace would have already sent a reply, confirming they'd received her message. Everything should have been quick and smooth, but she was still a little worried. The gentleman said he had already returned, and that after receiving her letter, the process from the imperial palace would take approximately 2 months to reach the lands of Drax. The wait was considerable but unavoidable. They agreed to summon the imperial knights to reveal the crown prince's life. She wasn't worried about this plan, as it was all designed to show everyone that the prince was alive and well. He plans to invite representatives of the northern region's nobility, so the girl must take this into account. Although she will only be the heir in name, they must still announce the arrival of the princess, even if her role is symbolic. The girl wondered if she could ask him why he never got married. It seemed curious, especially given his situation. The question wasn't casual. She genuinely wanted to understand the reasons. The Duke, noticing her curiosity, asked why he was so interested in this girl. She explained that it was important to her, as it wasn't every day that important figures were asked such a personal question, and she couldn't ignore it. All this is connected to the fact that marriages among aristocrats are often used for diplomatic purposes. For the Duke, who aspires to become emperor, such a move would be beneficial. This realization made the girl question his true motives. The Duke replied that he had no particular reason for marriage. She wondered if perhaps he'd never met the right person. However, she couldn't quite believe his claim that he simply didn't want to. Aristocrats typically marry for a variety of reasons: to restore their family line, improve their position, or even find true love. But if the marriage conditions don't align with these goals, such a union is unlikely to be consummated for love. There were many aristocrats in the government, but even more in the imperial family. It would be interesting to know why the crown prince remained single until he was 25. It was odd, as such questions usually didn't go unexplained in such high circles. He had a beloved woman, likely the one who would have played the role of empress. However, despite her importance, he was not the typical man who would simply abandon his beloved for another union. He reflected that there were many other things that were causing him pain, but of course, the most important was the prince's blood. Clearly, Her Highness had more than one or two things that were causing him headaches. Rosica, watching him, thought he probably had his reasons for not marrying, and it was most likely related to something personal. After all, the name he'd given her wasn't random. It wasn't just the first thing that came to mind. Intrigued, she decided to learn more about Rosica. He turned away and said she wasn't just a constant companion, but someone he wouldn't dare build anything serious with. She replied with a smile that he shouldn't joke, and it seemed there was a woman he was trying to keep quiet about, and her name was Rosica. Was he hiding something, or was this just a fantasy? But he explained that things weren't as she thought. If he ever had a daughter, he'd like to name her Rosica. It was just a guess about the future, nothing more. Rosica remarked that if he'd already chosen a name for his daughter, then perhaps he wasn't so opposed to marriage. All this suggested he'd probably decide to marry someday, but right now it wasn't so important. The girl suggested that this meant that, although he was not thinking about marriage now, if someone came along who interested him, he might well make a decision and marry her in the future. To become emperor, he needed to fill the archduchess's vacancy. She asked him to throw a magnificent reception in honor of her joining the family, to make the event as festive as possible. She wanted to invite every aristocrat in the area to congratulate her. This was a moment worth celebrating, and she didn't want to miss the chance to demonstrate her importance. The young girl, who had become a princess thanks to a fortunate encounter with a duke, would now behave like a little child. She enjoyed the moment, doing what she liked and everything that brought her joy. But aristocrats alone weren't enough for a celebration. She thought it would be boring without congratulations from dignitaries, so she decided to accept congratulations from the king, queen, and the prince himself. The duke asked again if the girl was really asking to invite King Ravida. He was surprised by her request, as the decision could have affected the entire course of events. He waited for her to clarify her intentions. The girl confirmed her request, but the duke expressed doubts. He noted that Ravida came from a barbarian family, had no proper upbringing, and that the king might be rude in his treatment. The girl calmly replied that if Ravida behaved inappropriately, he himself could shut him up. The duke in turn began to say that even if everyone united against Ravida, he would still defeat them all. She reminded him that the small kingdoms and their rulers might not be planning to attack right now, but they were keeping a close eye on the situation, gathering and observing without taking any action. Of course, she knew that without such a strong leader as Rexide, they would have broken into imperial territory long ago. Without him, the borders would have collapsed, and a frenzied campaign would have erupted. She couldn't help but remark that Rexide was truly an incredible man. Even if she had exaggerated a bit, everything she said was true. This man possessed a special majesty and strength. It was thanks to Rexide that the empire remained unconquered. It was a reliable defense against the northern countries, small kingdoms that watched everything with interest, ready to intervene in case of weakness. Ravida is the most powerful of the minor kingdoms, and their strength could play a significant role now. However, the duke reminded her that Rosica had never met them in person. He warned that the Ravitans were extremely rude and accustomed to doing as they pleased. Rosica calmly replied that it wasn't a big deal. If anyone dared to say anything nasty about her, she would definitely let them know. She clearly wasn't afraid of possible ridicule or rudeness. She understood perfectly well that the duke couldn't be by her side constantly, watching over her every second, but she didn't demand it. She knew he trusted her to handle situations independently. However, glancing at him, she noticed that he looked worried. His expression was reminiscent of a solicitous bird carefully guarding its chick. This moment even amused her a little. However, it was time to put aside idle chatter and get down to business. They couldn't waste time on idle thoughts. An important discussion lay ahead. With so many servants arriving at the estate, Rosica immediately noticed that it now felt more like a place where people actually lived rather than a dreary fortress. Everything seemed livelier, if a little unusual. However, this irritated the duke. He wasn't used to this kind of thing, and what irritated him even more was the fact that he was about to meet an aristocrat. This was his first experience of this kind, and so he was now forced to learn etiquette to which he was completely unprepared. The more the duke thought about it, the more horrified he became. He couldn't understand how this had anything to do with etiquette, since, in his opinion, Rosica was simply leading him by the nose, passing off strange things as rules. At that moment, Owen the butler approached, inquiring how the training was going. The duke stared at him in obvious shock, then irritably declared that he must have forgotten his eyes if he thought everything was going well. Rosica chuckled and, shaking her head, advised the duke to watch his words. Her gaze was mocking, as if she already knew how events would unfold. She then asked Owen to demonstrate one of the examples to the Duke, mentioning that a certain remark about a thief was about to follow. The butler turned to Rosica and asked her an unexpected question. "Is her father a thief?" The girl froze, blinking in confusion, and then smiled tensely, trying to hide her confusion. She replied that she didn't understand what he was talking about, but Owen merely smirked and continued, explaining that how else could her father have stolen all the stars from the sky and placed them in her eyes. Rosica blushed, but pretended that she was pleased to hear such words, although deep down, she felt awkward. The Duke, however, was literally shocked by this scene. He was shocked and, with obvious indignation, declared that he definitely couldn't do that. Owen raised his eyebrows in surprise, astonished that the Duke couldn't even utter such a simple phrase. Rosica also looked at him with bewilderment, not understanding why he found it so difficult. The Duke, although a little slow-witted, even began to realize that this etiquette lesson was somehow strange. He opened the book and read the following example. "They say that all the confectionaries of the world went bankrupt, because the sweetness of Rosica eclipsed their products." He frowned as he continued reading. It read, "I don't understand what you're doing here. You're an angel. Who will protect heaven while you're gone?" Owen chuckled and noted that it sounded more like a commander's speech before battle. Rosica sighed heavily, reminding him that they had been training for 3 days, but the Duke was making no progress. The Duke exploded with indignation, declaring that even a complete simpleton could see that these phrases were intended to seduce girls. He demanded to know why he was being taught such things. Rosica calmly replied that everything was simple. He had to learn how to seduce a girl. The Duke narrowed his eyes slyly and grinned. Now everything was clear. She had finally revealed her true face. A fraud! He leaned forward, wondering who exactly he was supposed to seduce. But Rosica remained silent, in no hurry to answer. A moment later, she calmly announced that his target was Princess Ravita. The Duke stood up and said she seemed to have lost her mind. She pointed out that he had said he wanted to avenge the Crown Prince's death and become emperor. It was all part of her plan, so he must follow it. But the gentleman said he wasn't going to do that, so she asked again if he really was sure of it. And then she asked him if he'd thought about it before answering. He started shouting and saying that a new successor would be needed, so she tells him to get his hands on the small kingdom and be recognized as the successor. She noted that he truly understood everything perfectly. The gentleman remarked that she didn't think about it at all from Princess Ravita's perspective. She tells him to marry a woman for whom he has no feelings, so he does not understand what the princess did wrong. Rosica said that if he did the same to her, he might actually fall in love with her. The Duke began to say that it couldn't be done just by wanting to. The girl asked him to listen to her and began to talk about the fact that all members of noble families conduct dynastic marriages. This is a well-known practice. The Duke said that he knew about it. Raven also had a headache because of all these marriage issues. Because of the stress, he felt like he had aged 10 years. Rosica told him not to let it get to the point where he too starts to get a headache, and that he should learn everything. He has no good or anything, no power in political circles, no connections. For a prince like him, who has nothing, to be able to rise to the top, only this method will do. If he is not ready to make even such a sacrifice, then it is better to give up everything right now. The day so many had been waiting for finally arrived. The majestic procession of the Ravita royal family crossed the duchy's borders, approaching the site of the celebration. Their arrival signaled the beginning of a long-awaited event, prepared for with particular trepidation. Of all the minor kingdoms, only Ravita was honored to attend the celebration. This meant they were recognized as special, which filled them with indescribable delight. Being invited into this intimate circle was a great honor for them, and they felt incredibly happy. They were especially pleased that, unlike the noble guests from the north who were scheduled to arrive on the day of the celebration, they were given special attention. This once again emphasized their privileged position and importance in the eyes of their hosts. To show Ravita due respect, they were asked to arrive early, 2 days before the celebration. This gesture emphasized the significance of their presence, making them feel truly special among all the guests. The game had begun. Everything that had been planned was about to come to fruition. Now it was time to act. From this moment on, every step mattered. Every word could influence the future course of events. Rosica looked closely at the Duke and gently said that if he was still in a bad mood, she wouldn't want him to get angry. She tried to speak calmly, making it clear she had no intention of irritating him or causing him displeasure. She also expressed sincere regret for forcing him to do something he didn't want. It hadn't been her intention, but circumstances had dictated that she insist. She hoped he would understand her intentions correctly. However, the Duke unexpectedly admitted his guilt. He said with a slight grin that he should be the one apologizing for his behavior, as he had acted like a child. In response, the girl asked him to try again, suggesting they practice together a little while longer. The Duke agreed, though he seemed to be pondering his words. At that moment, he looked completely different, not like his usual self. He was surprisingly sweet, almost charming, and there was no denying that he was a truly attractive man. Suddenly, he looked up and, a little embarrassed but with a hint of playfulness, asked her if her father was a thief. This unexpected question caught her off guard, and for a moment she was taken aback, unsure how to react. Pretending to be completely unaware of what he was talking about, she asked with mild confusion what exactly he meant. However, her intuition told her it was some kind of trick, but the solution was still elusive. On second thought, she might have a decent answer. However, before saying a word, she decided to wait for the Duke's explanation. The question was too strange to be answered seriously right away. The Duke hesitated for a moment, but then, gathering his resolve, he finally spoke. He looked at her carefully and said that the stars, they really are all here. His voice carried genuine conviction. But Rosika still didn't understand what he was getting at. Frowning, she asked him again. The Duke looked confused but explained anyway. He was saying that her father must have stolen all the stars from the sky and placed them in her eyes. Immediately after these words, the Duke suddenly jumped up and began pacing back and forth, as if trying to hide his embarrassment. Rosika simply watched him, unsure how to react. She blushed slightly, looking at him with mild surprise. Having collected her thoughts a bit, the girl asked him to stop and hear her out. She wanted to say that his sentence hadn't sounded bad at all. Quite the contrary. There was something to it. He might not have understood it himself, but he delivered it quite well. No one knows what might happen in the future. So she explained to him that the most important thing was to simply do as he had learned. There was no need to obsess over details. The key was sincerity. Then everything would seem natural. Hearing this, the Duke literally blossomed. He was delighted at the thought that this was enough, and that his efforts had not been in vain. At that moment, he was completely confident, and believed he had passed the test with flying colors. Rosika confirmed his suspicions, letting him know he had indeed succeeded. This visibly pleased him, and he sighed with relief, as if a heavy burden had just been lifted from his shoulders. He tried his best, but in the end, he couldn't find the right words to say in a gentle tone. She should have pointed this out directly, but looking at him, she couldn't. He looked so sweet in that moment that even her own thoughts became confused. For some reason, her consciousness seemed to shut down, and her head went blank. She couldn't gather her thoughts, and the words simply wouldn't come to her mind. The moment completely threw her off balance. The gentleman felt sincere gratitude to the Duke for his invitation. This gesture was important to him, as the trip to the castle provided an opportunity to discuss key issues and strengthen ties. The Duke, in turn, was grateful that his master had taken the trouble to travel so far to Drax. He knew the journey could be tiring, but he understood its importance. Rex had said he hoped their time together at the castle would be beneficial. He hoped their relationship would grow stronger and their trust in each other would deepen. The man looked at the Duke with slight bewilderment, noticing a girl standing behind him. Her presence raised questions, as he hadn't expected to see anyone else there. Rosika peered cautiously from behind the Duke's broad frame, trying not to attract unnecessary attention. Her gaze met his, and she carefully studied his expression. Without losing her dignity, the girl greeted His Majesty with respect. She bowed gracefully, demonstrating respect and observing all the rules of court etiquette. The man froze for a moment, amazed by the sight. He hadn't expected to meet a princess here, and upon realizing this, he warmly remarked that he was very pleased to meet her in person. The Duke, watching him, couldn't help but think, if this giant had wanted to, he could have simply blown Rosika away with his breath. The difference in their sizes was impressive. The girl introduced herself in a calm, confident voice. She expressed her sincere gratitude for his kindness and for taking the time to visit their castle, showing such respect. The king replied with a slight smile that they had brought Revita's treasures as a token of congratulations. He hoped these gifts would please her and be a treasured gift. Their presence alone was significant to her, but to receive such luxurious gifts was unexpected. Now she felt completely forgiven. Reading the history of the kingdom of Revita, she became increasingly eager to meet this man. But she couldn't even imagine that he would so easily accept their invitation and come in person. The gentleman was astonished by this discovery. He hadn't expected the princess to have studied their country's history so deeply. This clearly spoke of her inquisitive mind and curiosity. Revita's story was little known, even among her subjects. It seemed all the more surprising that a young aristocrat from another empire was reading it, and with such interest. Of course, this was a source of admiration. Few paid attention to these notes, especially those unrelated to Revita. Her knowledge was pleasantly surprising. Rosica enthusiastically shared that she was particularly impressed by the exploits of the first king. Reading about his exploits sent shivers down her spine with admiration. She especially remembered his famous line, "If a man must die, let it be on the battlefield," and also the part about the head of the frost season. The king laughed, noting that he was pleasantly surprised. A noble lady from a distant empire had shown such a keen interest in the history of a savage state. He hadn't expected anyone from the aristocracy to want to learn about the past of his people. Rosica replied that if no one had told her this story, she would never have known about all this. And yet such knowledge is priceless? Isn't it a shame to miss the opportunity to learn something that could change your view of the world? She then reminded the king that he himself had spoken of the deep connection between Ravit and Drax. Moreover, he had personally chosen for her the book that detailed this story, so he too considered it important. She watched his reaction closely, waiting for confirmation. However, the king seemed unsure when exactly he'd said it. Then Rosica, leaning forward impatiently, asked the question more insistently, demanding an answer. Finally, the man admitted that he had indeed been searching for this book for a long time. The king remarked that it was a great honor for his people to see someone so interested in their history, and willingly so. The princess standing nearby truly looked refined and beautiful. She seemed to be the epitome of grace and nobility. The others would do well to learn from her, given the chance to be near her. But Rosica hastened to assure that she was being overly praised. There were surely many people in the empire who dreamed of meeting the descendants of great warriors and learning their stories firsthand. The duke, watching her words closely, noted that Rosica was masterfully playing the game. At that moment, the king's daughter appeared behind them. She noted with mild surprise that Rosica was actually very small. The princess wondered if all the girls in the empire were really that short. She'd never met anyone so petite, and she found it quite curious. The duke frowned, finding such words extremely rude. How could one so bluntly tell someone they were small at their first meeting? It was simply disrespectful. But Rosica merely smiled good-naturedly, replying that the princess was indeed incredibly tall. The girl then explained that in her kingdom, almost everyone was that tall. She'd even heard that many in the empire were uncomfortable around tall people. But Rosica admitted that from the moment she arrived at the castle, her attention had been focused solely on the princess. She just couldn't stop admiring her. How amazing that someone could look so stunning. The princess asked, puzzled, and Rosica, increasingly captivated, continued. In her opinion, her height made her look even more majestic. She imagined her launching an arrow on the battlefield, and her heart began to pound wildly. These words surprised the princess, and she asked how Rosica knew she could shoot a bow. She replied with a smile that the princess was the most renowned archer among women in the kingdom of Revita. So, if she didn't mind, Rosica would gladly take the chance to learn how to at least hold a bow properly. She wasn't expecting much, but it would be fun to try. Of course, she didn't even hope to become a good shot, but it would be great to understand at least a little how to handle a gun. The princess stated with ease and without a shadow of a doubt that it would be quite simple. She promised to certainly help with this, as teaching someone to use a bow is not such a difficult task. The duke watched her manner of speech closely. He found her insightful, even though she pretended to be an aristocrat from a distant empire, seemingly eager to meet the warriors of the north. She chose every word with particular care, meticulously constructing her speech to sound perfect for her interlocutor. This made her communication particularly persuasive and appropriate. The girl wanted to make sure and asked again whether the princess really agreed to teach her how to use a bow, because it seemed something incredible. The princess, without losing her friendliness, confirmed with a smile that, of course, she would be happy to help her and teach her everything she needed. Rosica quickly added that she had simply been overly excited, which was why she had spoken so hastily. She apologized for this, considering her reaction inappropriate. However, the princess merely gently remarked that there was nothing wrong with it and saw no reason to apologize. She was not at all embarrassed by such emotions. Then Rosica, after thinking for a moment, noticed that the title Queen would suit the princess much more than just princess. Hearing this, the princess asked in surprise whether she had really just said something like that. Then she laughed, and Rosica asked with fear whether she had been tactless again towards Her Majesty and the royal family. The princess asked, slightly perplexed, why Rosica apologized so often. Such words didn't bother her at all, so there was no need to worry. Rosica said with relief that she was very happy about this. In any case, she always thought the princess's height made her look even more majestic. However, she herself would like her hand to be at least a little larger. The princess, smiling, said that if Rajika called her small, it only emphasized how sweet and charming she was. Rosika noted with surprise that no one had ever said such a thing to her before, and the Duke, watching all this, was pleased with how her plan was going. However, despite this, he could not understand why all this irritated him so much, causing him to experience internal discomfort. If she was going to behave this way, then perhaps it would have been better to do without his participation and simply seduce her on her own. At that moment, the prince appeared and politely greeted both the princess and Rosika, attracting the attention of everyone present. He was the first in line to the throne of the kingdom of Rowita, Prince Haram. His status made his appearance especially significant. Rosika had no particular desire to see him, but, not wanting to seem rude, she smiled politely and said that it was a great honor for her to meet him. The young man carefully surveyed his surroundings and noted with surprise that the empire was, it turned out, full of truly beautiful girls. Compared to what he was used to, this was a pleasant discovery. He was especially happy to see such a lovely princess in front of him, because all his life he had been surrounded by tall and awkward ladies who were not even close to this graceful person. With these thoughts in mind, the Duke confidently stepped forward and stood directly before Princess Rosika. His gaze was calm yet searching, as if he were trying to read something in her face. He didn't waste time on unnecessary conversations and simply stated that no unnecessary words were needed. Everything was crystal clear. The crown prince was clearly delighted to see the Duke. He noted with a smile that they hadn't seen each other for a long time, not since they had worked together to suppress the rebellion. He sincerely thanked the Duke for the invitation, to which the Duke in turn nodded reservedly, expressing gratitude that the prince had arrived. However, the Duke then added that such a manner of addressing the girl was completely inappropriate. This was not a battlefield, and one should behave accordingly. The prince laughed, taking the hint, and quickly apologized if his words might have sounded rude. The Duke, however, merely shrugged, noting that he wasn't going to dictate how the prince should speak to him, but it was best not to use such language when addressing a girl. The crown prince apologized again, this time more seriously. He acknowledged that perhaps he had indeed been rude to the princess, and since he was in the empire, he should behave as befitted its honorable citizens. He admitted that he only knew the Archduke well, which was why he allowed himself such a casual tone. He wouldn't have dared to speak so unceremoniously with others. He also noted that if someone unfamiliar with the Duke heard him called a savage, they would easily believe it. There was something rough, almost feral, about him that the prince found so appealing. He seemed like a man of his own kind. Suddenly, as if to himself, he added thoughtfully that he thought the princess had shown an interest in military operations. It was unexpected but curious. The prince continued, recalling how they lined up the rebels who dared to raise a hand against them and then slowly and methodically flayed the skin from each of them. Rosika tensed. She realized the prince was once again unaware of where he was and to whom he was speaking. Without thinking, she grabbed his arm sharply and ordered him to stop immediately. Then, softening a little, she apologized for his words and asked those around him to be understanding of his complete lack of upbringing. The Duke nodded calmly, agreeing with the prince. He, like no one else, knew what a life full of battle meant, having spent many years on the battlefield himself. These battles had hardened him, and so he understood what was being said. The crown prince, on the other hand, looked slightly perplexed. He saw nothing sinister in what had happened and wondered why his sister was acting so seriously. He felt she was making too much of the situation. Rosika immediately cut short his thoughts, ordering him to shut his mouth. Her father, Duke Rexide, merely nodded approvingly, fully supporting his daughter. His gaze made it clear she'd said exactly what needed to be said. The greeting had already dragged on, and everyone knew it. Deciding not to prolong the formalities, they agreed to end the conversation. The Duke invited the guests to make themselves comfortable, indicating that they could now relax. After this, Rosika turned to the crown prince, clearly about to say something important. A focused expression appeared in her gaze, and her lips were about to utter carefully chosen words. Before speaking, however, she turned to the butler. Her voice was concerned as she asked if everything was all right. Owen seemed pleasantly surprised by the attention and replied with a smile that he was quite pleased. He began talking about the palace, its traditions, and how the royal family had reacted to Rosika's arrival. He said the princess and her courtiers were talking about her almost non-stop, clearly impressed. They'd arrived here only half an hour ago, and already Rosika had managed to captivate everyone present. This realization warmed her soul. At that moment, the Duke entered and, glancing at her, suggested that she might be afraid. She immediately asked what they were talking about. her brows furrowed slightly. The Duke explained that he thought she was frightened by the flaying scene, or whatever they called it. A hint of irony crept into his voice. However, Rosica replied without the slightest hesitation that if that was what he meant, she wasn't at all frightened. There was a hint of mockery in her tone, as if the matter wasn't even worth discussing. The Duke sighed and clarified that she shouldn't misunderstand him. He had indeed gone there to stop the rebel army, but the whole flaying story was complete nonsense, completely unrelated to the truth. According to the official version, the rebel forces were destroyed by the kingdom's army. At the time, this foolish prince was at the head of their forces, and that's why he was now spreading such rumors. Judging by Rosica's expression, Prince Harem's words had stung, but he added as if casually that he didn't enjoy the process of flaying at all, and that he didn't like laughing at such moments either. Rosica glanced at the Duke with curiosity, noticing how zealously he defended himself. Of course, she had long known of his bloody exploits. The hundreds of enemy heads left on the battlefield spoke for themselves. The Duke tried to explain, but the girl merely calmly remarked that he didn't necessarily need to try so hard to look good in front of her. She wasn't the type to be surprised by cruelty or military achievements. Sighing, she added indifferently that she saw in him a man accustomed to slicing lice without a second thought. Everyone knew he had no qualms about killing, and it certainly wouldn't surprise her. The Duke chuckled and didn't deny her words. Of course, he wasn't completely insensitive, but overall, yes, he was, as Rosica had described him. He had no need to hide his nature. The butler, Owen, observing their conversation, cheerfully interjected that the girl should not make fun of the gentleman so cruelly, otherwise he would soon burst into tears. Rosica, turning her head slightly, mockingly asked the Duke if he was trying to outdo Prince Har in impressing her. He seemed overzealous in this endeavor. She'd always assumed that talk of the savage nature of that state's royal family was a thing of the past. But now she couldn't understand what was going on with this prince. What was going on in his head? You'd think a man would be ashamed of his barbaric past. But this fool, on the contrary, is proud of it. He openly extols the fact that his ancestors were savage and merciless. It feels like time has turned back, like they're returning to their roots. This could be a problem. However, the decision was made to keep these people close and try to win them over. But if this prince suddenly decides to enter the central political arena, only angry glances and mistrust await them. Not everyone is ready to accept him and his barbaric legacy. However, among the inhabitants of that state, there are now almost no people left who hate the people of the empire. Times are changing, and the boundaries between peoples are becoming increasingly blurred. However, if such a person were to become the next ruler, the situation could become more complicated. The king is clearly concerned that his state will once again appear to the world as a gathering of savages. As far as Rosica knew, the king originally had 18 children, princes and princesses. But ultimately, he himself killed them all, leaving only one heir. Here's how you can expand each paragraph while maintaining the original plot and context. The butler, noticing her hesitation, asked if she meant to say that the royal family had other children besides the prince and princess. The Duke, in response, confirmed this without hesitation. King Rosita was known for his strict stance on morality and honor. He forgave no one whose actions could weaken the palace's authority. The royal family's image was of the utmost importance to him. Because of this, he took extreme measures and took the lives of his own children, believing that their savage nature and unstable behavior threatened the family's authority. This decision was dictated by his desire to maintain the prestige of royal power. In this situation, Rosica began to wonder if they should perhaps reconsider their actions and change their approach to solving the problem. This could be the key to successfully overcoming the crisis. The Duke was pleased by her thought, and, to some extent, hoped it meant he wouldn't have to utter the same cruel words and phrases he'd spoken to the princess. The relief was evident on his face, but Rosica glanced at him and, not understanding what he meant, said that he would have to intensify his efforts to seduce her. Her words left the Duke perplexed, for she had no intention of backing down. The Duke was stunned by her answer. He quickly noticed she was speaking of strategy, but he couldn't understand how exactly that should affect his actions. He had expected a different approach, but her words left him baffled. She replied that this was precisely why he should be even closer to the princess. After all, her goal was to make him act decisively and be more decisive in his actions. This clearly eluded the Duke. The girl urged him to go immediately and invite the princess for a walk in the garden. But the Duke seemed unprepared. For some reason, he was reluctant to follow her instructions. Rosica, not understanding his resistance, insistently ordered him to move faster. She was puzzled by his refusal, since to her it was an obvious step. She couldn't understand why he was so reluctant to agree. The Duke, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control, asked for at least a minute to calm down. This was his attempt to collect his thoughts before meeting the princess again. But the girl, having already decided everything for him, slammed the door without giving him a second to think. The Duke, sighing, went to carry out her orders. It was at that moment he realized he couldn't stop her determination. As they hid in the bushes, the butler, clearly unsure of their actions, asked again if they really should follow this plan. He wasn't sure it was the right way, but he continued to follow their instructions. The lady replied that the situation reminded her of a small child afraid to enter the water. He stands on the shore, but can't bring himself to take a step. She, however, was ready to move forward, ignoring her fears. Now, despite the danger, they moved forward and Rosica told them to duck to avoid being seen. This was a crucial part of her plan, and she knew their success depended on every small step. The butler, observing them, remarked that they truly looked good together. It was a strange yet obvious observation. They were like two halves of a single whole, despite all the difficulties. Rosica, noticing his gaze, paused and agreed with his words. However, her face expressed something strange. It was confusion, or perhaps mild displeasure, but she didn't reveal it. The Duke asked Rosica to tell him what exactly had changed in her plans. He couldn't figure out what she was planning and didn't know what to do. He tried to figure out the reasoning behind her decision. Rosica explained that they needed Revita, but without her Roma at the helm. She believed the situation needed to be changed, but she also understood that the plan shouldn't include people who could ruin everything. The Duke was heir to the throne, but Rosica told him that if he made a mistake, his father would immediately turn against him. It turned out not to be as difficult as he thought. He just had to be careful. The Duke inquired about her plans for the future, and Rosica replied that she had an interesting idea, but to implement it, he would need to get closer to the princess, understand her better, and find common ground. While walking with the Duke, the princess noticed him talking as if he was ready to give her something important. This didn't go unnoticed, and she immediately realized it involved a secret and significant gift. The Duke realized the princess had taken his words precisely this way, and he confirmed that he truly wanted to convey something special to her. He was ready to carry out his plan, though his feelings remained mixed. When the girl saw what the Duke was actually about to tell her, she was shocked. She saw a smile on his face that promised nothing good, as if some mystery lurked behind it. It was a national treasure of Revita, acquired during the previous suppression of the rebels and sent to Archduke Rexid, but the girl couldn't understand why he had decided to return it. The Duke explained that he had no intention of simply returning the treasure, but wanted to give her a gift. His words sounded hesitant, as if he wasn't entirely sure how to present it. However, he couldn't quite express his intentions directly. He hesitated, unsure how to continue. Rosica sensed that he would finally decide to say it was a gift for her, and even hang the necklace around her neck. But in the end, the Duke finally said he was simply returning her treasure and tossed the necklace into her arms. He couldn't hide his uncertainty, and his actions seemed strange and awkward to her. The girl was a little surprised, but grateful. She hadn't expected to receive this treasure again and said her father would be delighted with such a gift. She noted that this event had come as a surprise to her. Rosica and the butlers were very disappointed. The Duke had failed in his plan again. But Rosica hoped that at least he could add a few words, a pre-prepared phrase, to make everything more convincing. The Duke turned to the princess, his face clearly agitated, his voice slightly trembling. He remarked that he wanted to ask her something important. It all seemed strange and awkward. He thought for a moment, and, choosing his words carefully, dared to ask if her father was a thief. The question was quite unusual, and it left the princess surprised and confused. The girl didn't feel the terrible feeling she should have, but she was still slightly stunned. However, she soon smiled, trying to hide her bewilderment and continue the conversation. After asking again, she wondered why he had asked such a strange question. The Duke, a little embarrassed, said it was just his guess, but he couldn't explain it for sure. He was clearly embarrassed, unsure how to explain his question or what he was even hinting at. It was as if his words were simply inappropriate and he himself didn't know what to say. The girl became increasingly confused and, asking clarifying questions, tried to understand what exactly the Duke meant. He, in turn, immediately remembered how he had said this to Rosica before. Previously, it had simply been a training exercise, but now the situation was completely different. The Duke explained that her father simply looked that way, and that it was nothing serious, but he said it hesitantly. Rosica and the butler were completely confused at that moment, unsure how to react to the Duke's strange words. Neither could figure out what to do in this absurd situation. The situation was becoming increasingly confusing. The princess, confused, asked what he meant. His words didn't make sense, and now she was beginning to doubt his sanity. The princess began to wonder if this duke was mad. She couldn't understand how anyone could say such a thing, and her bewilderment became more and more obvious. He asked if her father was a thief, adding that he looked like one. This accusation was very strange and puzzled the girl, her gaze growing increasingly suspicious. But that wasn't all. The duke didn't stop there. He recommended the princess drink some water, as if it could somehow improve her condition or ease her doubts about his strange words. He tried calling her a flower, but that seemed to confuse her even more. Then he said that maybe she ate too much and that could be a problem. He seemed out of place in that too. The duke had never met anyone who ate so much, and he was worried she would have indigestion. He urged her to drink some water, hoping it would somehow help. The girl was furious. He had clearly lost his mind, but suddenly Princess Rosica intervened, offering her own version of events, and this calmed her down somewhat. Princess Rosica remarked that perhaps her mood had been soured by the duke's strange words during the meal. She was prepared to accept the explanation that everything had happened because of him. The princess said that despite everything, she had indeed eaten a lot and therefore wasn't offended by the duke's words. She tried to understand his motives and took it with humor. Rosica tried to justify the duke, claiming he hadn't meant to offend her but was simply clumsily trying to be considerate. Hearing this, the princess felt relieved and calmed down. The princess thanked Rosica for her understanding and support. She felt that Rosica wasn't simply trying to justify the duke, but truly understood his intentions and helped her to calm her worries. The princess noticed that Rosica had a truly excellent stance and praised her for it. Rosica in turn thanked her and asked her to show her how to shoot a bow properly. The girl happily agreed, immediately picking up the bow and demonstrating her skills. She wasn't one to shy away from displaying her strength and confidence, and it was obvious to everyone. Rosica began by saying that her relationship with the prince wasn't particularly good, but she apologized whenever she made a mistake. This was her way of showing her sincerity and willingness to make amends. The princess asked if Rosica meant Haroma and clarified that their relationship wasn't that bad. The prince was simply too rude to treat her like royalty. Rosica expressed a desire to apologize for what happened, explaining that she and the duke don't have the best relationship. She said she couldn't have acted differently as it wasn't her decision. They often disagreed, and this situation was no exception. However, the princess always seemed to be quick to express her opinion on any matter. Rosica was absolutely delighted, and asked to be given the chance to try it too. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity as she waited for the princess to agree to her request. The princess didn't object, agreeing to let her try, but Rosica wasn't trying at all, and the result was far from what she expected. She missed the mark and shrugged, not too upset. She remarked that it wasn't that easy, but the princess replied that she too had just picked up a bow, and for her first time, her result was incredibly good. It felt like a small victory for her. Rosica admitted that during the purge of the rebels they had spoken of, she herself would have liked to join the army to help fight those who stood against the kingdom. The rebels were those who had previously refused to recognize the kingdom's authority and had joined the empire attempting to side with its opponents. These people were especially dangerous. She was sure that her brother, Raven, would mercilessly blame the rebels for what happened, without thinking about the reasons for their actions, because for him, punishment was important, not an analysis of the situation. Despite the uprising, Rosica believed it was possible to understand the people who staged it. After all, it's not easy to become an intellectual when you've lived your whole life like a savage and suddenly have to change your way of life. Rosica thought that the slow re-education of such people was the kingdom's responsibility, and the princess, of course, agreed with her point of view, sharing the opinion on the importance of this process. Rosica honestly admitted that she thinks that Revita would rule much better if she became queen, as she has all the qualities to be worthy of this role. However, the reality was far harsher. Becoming a queen requires not only a dream, but also the ability to govern and make difficult decisions in any situation. There are people who were destined from birth to sit on the throne, and while that throne may not be right for them, they are obligated to fulfill their destiny, no matter the circumstances. In a country where intellectuals often contest power, coups occur even among the highest strata of society. For example, the crown prince who now sits on the throne is the result of such changes. Emperor Hexen I, founder of a great empire, left his legacy to his 8th son. Although his reign was fraught with cruelty and conflict, his son succeeded in seizing the throne and continuing his legacy. Despite Hexen II getting rid of his brothers, The country experienced significant changes under his rule. Many saw him as a cruel ruler, but under his rule, the state reached unprecedented heights. For Ravita and for most people, there was no turning back. People were obliged to pay for their actions, and retribution for a mistake wasn't just a punishment, but a matter of life and death. In the future, Prince Harem will undoubtedly not only be crowned king, but also become a target for many. His status as a dangerous target cannot be ignored, and there will always be a threat in his path. Rosica, always confident in her skill, believed the princess would hit the mark. She knew she always hit the mark, no matter how difficult. As the girl watched in amazement, her emotions couldn't contain themselves. Without warning, she fired sharply, aiming with incredible precision. The kingdom needed a decisive and wise leader capable of leading its people to prosperity. Rosica clearly understood the importance of this moment and confidently continued her actions. With this shot, the girl hit the target precisely in the center. Her confidence only grew, and she felt that this moment was crucial for her future. The princess was completely shocked by how quickly everything happened. But Rosica was pleased with herself, knowing her skill had not failed her. She felt the princess was a true leader. Ravika asked if it was true that this was Rosica's first time doing this. But the girl calmly reminded her that it was the princess who had taught her these techniques, and she proudly admitted it. Rosica, with a sly look, noted that despite everything, she already saw what a great leader she would become. She knew the princess's future was just beginning. Rosica realized that it was not in vain that she followed the chairman everywhere in her past life. She told the princess that it was a lot of fun, and the princess also remarked that she would think carefully about what Rosica had said today. Princess Ravita is second in line to the throne. She deeply loved her homeland. It was clear that she was ready to take responsibility for it, and there was only one problem. She had no thirst for power, but this was fixable. Rosica is a professional at motivating people, and now all that's left is to ensure that while the royal family is still in their palace, a situation occurs that would cause the prince to lose his father's support. Rexid needed a strong, high-quality ally to strengthen his position and gain recognition in the imperial palace. This was a key step in his plans, and allies were more important than ever. He didn't want Ravit, who was subservient to a cruel prince. Rosica, knowing he had no use for such allies, decided it was best to start with a provocation to bring everything to light. A stroll through the corridors led her to a maid standing there, bursting into tears. Rosica was perplexed, unable to understand what could have happened to provoke such a reaction. The maid looked confused, and Rosica couldn't figure out what had happened. Many thoughts raced through her head, but she couldn't find an answer, looking at her exhausted face. And at that moment, Rosica heard the prince's sharp, angry cry, screaming that the girl had completely lost her mind. The cry was filled with rage, and her attention immediately shifted to the situation. He didn't mince words, and upon seeing Rosica, he became even more frightened. His reaction was so unexpected that Rosica felt the tension in the air immediately become palpable. Rosica, without losing her composure, approached the maid and asked what had happened. She couldn't understand what had made the girl cry and look so agitated. The maids always taught her how to behave around nobles, especially princes, and she probably decided there was no need to go into further explanations. But her silence only made the situation worse. Perhaps she thought that explaining would only complicate matters and further confuse the situation. The maid tried to hide her concerns, but Rosica noticed her hesitation. Eventually, the maid replied that nothing had happened. Rosica, dissatisfied with this answer, declared that she needed to speak with the prince alone, and that the maid could go. The maid was so stunned that she asked her mistress if she was mistaken. She hadn't expected Rosica to be so determined to speak with the prince. Rosica, looking at her closely, asked if any of their servants had indeed behaved inappropriately, breaking tact with His Highness. This worried her. The prince, containing his anger, noted that despite the maid's mistakes, she had fulfilled her duties, and he forgave her. His words were clear and confident, which immediately relieved some of the tension. Rosica also apologized and added that she would train the maids herself in the future, but for now the maid could go. She would decide for herself what to do about this situation, without interfering in other people's affairs. All this happened because the lady had come here with the intention of speaking with the prince alone, not wishing to involve anyone else in their conversation. Her decision was absolutely clear. The maid, not knowing what to do, tried to persuade Rosica to give up her plan, but Rosica was firm in her decision and suggested that she go with her if she was so worried. Rosica smiled, realizing that this servant was far more intelligent and loyal than she had expected. This behavior made her regard her with new respect. The lady asked the girl's name, and she replied with a smile that her name was Layla. This name apparently didn't surprise the lady, who listened attentively. Layla, turning to the lady, suggested that if she wished to speak with His Highness, it would be better to postpone the conversation until the moment when the Duke was nearby, as this would be more appropriate. The lady nodded, agreeing with Layla's assessment. She noted that if nothing significant had truly happened in this room, there was nothing to worry about, and they could continue. She suggested Layla go inside without any fear, since if everything was calm, they could go in and continue the conversation. This decision seemed quite logical and correct. The prince, noticing how Layla was acting in his room, couldn't resist asking what she had to say that was so important. He was surprised by her decisiveness and actions. Rosika chuckled, noting that it would be a bit awkward if anyone noticed them. She was already getting annoyed at having to resort to formality when she could have been more frank with the prince. The prince was completely confused and couldn't understand what she meant. He hadn't expected such a frank approach and was at a loss how to respond to her words. Rosika, noticing his confusion, asked if she really should repeat her sentence. In her opinion, the prince clearly wanted her to remain silent, even though she hadn't intended to. She advised the prince not to worry about his perception issues. They were his problem, not hers. He became very angry, but Rajika remained calm, oblivious to his anger. The girl couldn't contain her emotions and called the prince a bastard, explaining that people like him, with such thoughts and behavior, are real problems for society. Rosika continued that if the prince couldn't think straight, he'd better get out of the way and not interfere. Her words were direct and unvarnished, which clearly angered him even more. The prince shouted in a rage that she was behaving this way because she didn't understand who he really was. He was sure she would suffer consequences for such behavior. He argued that the Duke would likely tolerate any of her antics and might even justify her actions, which only added to his confidence in his right to power. Rosika, ignoring his words, asked what business it was of his. It was just the two of them in the room, and she didn't care what he thought or what he might tell the Duke. Rosika noted with a hint of mockery that she was apparently perceived as a kind and naive lady who couldn't even catch a bug, or as a troublemaker who hadn't yet learned to exercise restraint. Rosika was so kind as to invite this wild man in. She treated him as a guest, which meant he had to behave decently now that he was here. Only with such behavior will he be shown respect and perceived differently. She patted his face without hesitation, asking if this man understood who he was and that he should act accordingly. This made him even more angry, and he raised his hand, preparing to hit her, unable to contain his anger. However, the next moment she opened her eyes and saw the Duke in front of her, who coldly asked the prince if he wished to end his life right there. Rosika considered this. She wished he'd hit her at least once, because that could have been a much more beneficial outcome. The Duke, having tolerated all his absurd speeches from the very beginning, said that the prince had now crossed all the boundaries of what was permissible and, apparently, decided to test how much he could tolerate everything. The prince, unable to bear it, began to shout that he had only seen her swinging at him, while all this was simply a harmless gesture, like a slap in the face. He, as the future King Ravida, was offended that this girl dared to hit him despite his status, because he was the heir to the throne. Rosika replied that if anyone heard about it, they would think that he stood quietly and did nothing, and that she simply slapped him. He replied that he simply found her funny, calling her a little fox, and did not understand why she was behaving this way now and not the way she had before. Rosika tried to explain to the Duke why she did this, but he did not listen to her explanation, claiming that she could have hit him because of her mood or for some other reason. The girl was completely shocked by the Duke's words, not expecting that he would take her actions so calmly and even justify them. The Duke said that if she had struck the prince, he should have accepted it and taken the blow without making a scene or making any claims. The prince asked if they really thought he would just turn a blind eye to this and not actually avenge the insult. The Duke, with obvious interest, asked again whether the prince was seriously threatening now, and what he was going to do about it if he still had the courage. Rexit was curious, but at the same time sad that he would not be able to find out how it would end if the prince did nothing while he was still alive. Rosika tried to stop the Duke as he began pulling something out of his jacket. She couldn't figure out what he was about to do and immediately sensed the situation was becoming dangerous. She decided to ask him, should she really just stand by and watch him abuse his maid? She didn't like the Duke's words, and she wasn't going to remain silent. Rosika responded by saying she didn't feel she had crossed a line by expressing her dissatisfaction. She was confident she had done the right thing by intervening and didn't regret it. The prince, smiling, said that in his opinion she was still too young to understand what was happening, "That's what girls are for," he said, "especially for soldiers like her and His Highness." The Duke, hearing these words, angrily ordered the prince to shut his mouth. He was irritated that the prince was so frank in expressing his point of view without regard for how it appeared to others. The prince seemed oblivious to the threat and continued speaking. He even told her how many girls he'd sent to the prince's hut when they were fighting the rebels. These words left Rosica with no choice. He added mockingly that he didn't believe the Duke was so petty as to spare one useless girl for the sake of a comrade. These words pierced Rosica's soul like a knife. She hadn't expected such cruelty. The Duke, unable to restrain himself, grabbed the prince and struck him in the face. He was ready to teach him a lesson, knowing he couldn't let such behavior go without consequences. The prince fell, but the Duke showed no mercy. The prince found himself on the ground, his face badly injured. The Duke, looking at him, asked if he understood why he was being punished. His gaze was hard, and his words were just as harsh. The Duke, having spoken these words, continued his actions. He pulled a dagger from his jacket, determined to see the matter through. Rosica watched the proceedings covertly, hoping that it would end without further casualties. This time, the Duke was determined to achieve symmetry. He intended to cut the prince on the other side, further disfiguring his face. His eyes burned with anger, and he was determined. Rosica couldn't remain silent any longer. She cried out, begging the Duke to stop these cruel actions. She couldn't understand why he continued to mock the prince, even though things had already gone too far. When the prince tried to rise, he noticed 2 of his teeth had fallen out. It was a moment that stunned him. He hadn't expected the fight to lead to such consequences, and he was shocked by what happened. The prince was in complete shock. He hadn't expected the injuries to be so severe. He stood there, unsure how to react, wondering how he could get out of this situation with such injuries. The Duke, noting the situation, chuckled and noted that the prince had spoken in front of the girl about how they had flayed the rebels. These words were cold and cynical, like the Duke himself, who felt not the slightest regret. He realized he had to use his mind, and after recalling everything, he gave a clear answer. His answer was clear and decisive, his thoughts were clear, and he explained it immediately. The Duke began asking if he had touched any of the women sent to him. He noted that he had sent several women to him for an answer. The Duke demanded an explanation for what he had done to the women. He warned that if the man remained silent, the consequences next time could be very serious. Rosica was confused. She couldn't understand why the Duke was starting the conversation with such a strange accent and asking such questions. It seemed absurd to her. She thought that now was not the time to delve into such trifles, and decided that it was better to focus on more important things, ignoring the Duke's words. However, the Duke persisted, declaring that it mattered to him and asking for her answer. Rosica felt she couldn't avoid this conversation. The prince was beside himself with rage. He declared that the Duke was only bragging about failing to take advantage of his opportunity, despite everything being handed to him on a silver platter. In response, the prince said that the man seemed to have never recovered and was unable to move, even after everything had been offered him. The rage in his voice was evident. Apparently, there was only one path left for Rosica to resolve everything. She decided to intervene and try to resolve the situation, despite its complexity. She said that if he puts a woman on the same level as things and continues to behave that way, then he is not only rude, but also a truly stupid person. The prince asked what she meant, and Rosica responded by asking if the thing hanging between his legs even worked. The question was direct and bold. The prince became furious again, not understanding what she was trying to say. He asked what she meant by the question, still trying to discern her intentions. Rosica explained that men like him, who can only talk, have one thing in common. They are powerless, unable to fulfill their responsibilities, and looking for excuses. She called him a piece of trash who, despite his insignificance, tries to show off as if he has something incredible, which in fact he doesn't. It was more of a self-protective instinct, although she hadn't intended to delve into his problems initially, but apparently it caught her attention and she felt some curiosity. She expressed the idea that women avoided him because he was impotent. After that, she told the Duke outright that Prince Ravita had, in fact, been impotent his entire life. The prince couldn't stand it any longer and started shouting that it was a lie and that he could prove it wasn't true. Rosica ran up to the Duke and declared that he seemed to have completely lost his mind. The Duke only confirmed her words, noting that this man seemed to have truly gone mad and did not understand how he could have done such a thing right here, in front of everyone. The prince cried out that she'd started it, but Rosica calmly replied that, judging by his reaction, she was probably right. This clearly offended him, and he couldn't hide his displeasure. In fact, Rosica was certain that Ravita's heir was impotent. She wondered what interesting story she could share with the northern aristocrats who would be visiting. She thought that there was nothing funnier than this situation, and it would be amusing to tell them what a ridiculous and weak man stood in the way of the throne. For members of the royal family, talk about their sexual functions, whether true or not, has always been an Achilles heel, a weak spot they try to hide. Therefore, Rosika was certain that the Harams would probably not take any risks, and would do their utmost to avoid such topics. She challenged the prince to a debate with her. She bet one vote that his apparatus wasn't working, and if it turned out to be okay, she promised to apologize to him. She asked him to kneel. The prince, not understanding why she wanted to do this, asked what the point of him kneeling before her was. The princess asked what exactly he would receive if she knelt before him. Her question was less a challenge than an attempt to understand his motives. But the girl corrected him, declaring that it was not she, but the Duke himself who would have to kneel before him. The princess was prepared to consider this his obligation. If that wasn't enough, she suggested another idea. Let him grant her a title. She could become Duke of the Drax Empire, gaining power and influence. Rosika was sure he would react now, and perhaps even get angry. She expected to see his patience and pride tested. However, the Duke, surprising her, calmly agreed. He said that he agreed with the proposal and that they would do exactly as she suggested. The prince, noticing how the situation was developing, approached and asked if Rosika was truly confident in her decision. He doubted her firmness. Rosika, without hesitation, replied that she was completely certain. Everything would be verified in 2 days, when the aristocrats arrived to bear witness to her words. The prince noted that she might be planning to dispatch the assassin within the next 2 days. He wondered what he would do if she later changed her mind. The girl, with a slight smile, noted that everyone around him was just like him and took off her ring. She asked if he knew what it was, hinting at its significance. She asked him not to act hastily, but he slipped the ring on his finger without hesitation. It was his decision, and he had no intention of backing down.